Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. And this is where I usually introduce myself, the host of many of these episodes. My name is Tony. But today, we are going to be looking at Final Fantasy X, which is an episode and a game that is just simply too big for one person. So, rather than me doing the intro, I'm going to let one of our friends do the honors.
G'day everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at gaming experience of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host ISO, and today we're going to look at Final Fantasy X, a role-playing game developed and published by Square for the Sony PlayStation 2 back in 2001, with a HD remaster following in later years. We're going to take a look at that game in just a couple of minutes, but first, as is usual, bit of housekeeping up front. I'm excited to be here, and I hope all you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I'd love to hear from you. And there are a few ways that you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the gaming community around this podcast, and we have a ton of fun on Discord. We do weekly, monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It's all out there, and I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Centerwald, David Morton, Sam Trodowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher False, Grayor, and Merrick. Thank you guys for supporting the show, and thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute with dollary dues or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. You guys are truly awesome, and I love you to bits.
ISO, I couldn't have done it better myself. Before we get into the main topic of the episode, which is of course Final Fantasy X, we do have some listener comments, and actually since this was ISO's episode, he decided to go out on Discord and effectively bribe people to try to give as many comments as possible about Final Fantasy X. I have collected all of those comments and feedback, and we're going to go through those right now before we get into the main sections of today's episode. So first, if I take a look out on Discord, the very first message is from Sneaky Pete, who says, "I'll be honest, I never played Final Fantasy X. I remember when I played Final Fantasy VIII, it felt like the game series was getting too heavy on the melodrama and angsty heroes for my taste. And then someone told me that in Final Fantasy X, your hero is a volleyball player. I imagined battles where your limit breaks were serve, bump, and spike. So I never gave the game a fair chance. Mea culpa? Well, Sneaky Pete, I will say that I was in the same boat as you, not necessarily with the volleyball thing, but I did not give Final Fantasy X a fair shake back when it first came out. This episode is my attempt to rectify that. I will definitely let you know what I think. Merbean also wrote in and said, Final Fantasy X is the first time I ever personally learned of someone who cared more about one portion of a game over the actual game itself. Back in university, I mentioned Final Fantasy X to an old friend of mine. He said that his roommate loves Final Fantasy X and plays it every day. He's played a couple of 100 hours and has the best blitzball team he had ever seen. I asked my friend what his roommate thought of the ending, and my friend said that his roommate has not finished it yet. I asked my friend why, and he said he didn't know, and said he likes the blitzball. The conversation kind of trailed off awkwardly at that point. Nowadays, with so many games that are designed to be ecosystems like Grand Theft Auto 5 and Grand Theft Auto Online, you see that more often, but I was thoroughly perplexed by this conversation at the time. Blitzball is perplexing to me as well. I am actually going to talk about that a little bit later as we go through the Final Fantasy X discussion, but it is crazy that somebody spent that much time playing Blitzball and not as much time actually beating the game. Bookie Gnu also wrote in and said, no particular comments about Final Fantasy X other than it's probably my favorite Final Fantasy that I haven't finished it. Of all the times I've started it though, I've never liked Blitzball. Those sound like fighting words to me, except for the fact that I absolutely agree with you. So we'll have to figure out why. I would love to understand who loves Blitzball and who despises Blitzball, at least in the game, as far as the mechanics and things like that. Maybe we'll do a poll out on Discord or somewhere to see who's in my camp versus who's in other people's camp. I'm not going to tell you which way ISO leans. We'll have to wait to see what he says later on in the episode. Sneaky Pete actually responded to that because he was like, what the heck's Blitzball? He said, I just Googled Blitzball and realized that I was misinformed about the sport in this game. I really thought it was volleyball. Oops. Yeah, it is Blitzball. It is a very specific sport created for Final Fantasy X. I like the concept of the sport. I just really don't like the mechanics behind it. We're going to move on. The Bay 101 clarifies and says, it's underwater soccer. Mostly from what I remember. That's a pretty good way of saying it. Film Kid, otherwise known as Wendell Jr., also added to the conversation and said, so to add to the Blitzball conversation / debate, first off, it's water polo rugby. Let's get that one straight, fellas. Anyway, I was pretty much the roommate of Merbean's friend. Probably close to 100 hours on Blitzball, though I did eventually beat the game. Don't get me wrong, I did like the overall story, but I just love Blitzball. I dare say it's better than Triple Triad, and that was the only thing that made playing Final Fantasy VIII bearable for me. But back to 10. There is an argument to be had for 10 having the best ensemble in the series. I think giving them a voice helps with that. By all means, I'm not saying that it's the best voiceover performances, but it is an added layer which makes this group of characters unforgettable for me. Now, I know ISO is trying to set records, so I normally wouldn't allow this, but Tony, if I may, please refer to episode 110 and play the theme to the greatest Final Fantasy villain of all time. For anyone who doesn't know, Film Kid is referring to our episode on Sounds of the Classics Square Enix edition, where we basically played the entirety of Dancing Mad, which was Kefka's theme from Final Fantasy VI. That theme takes up a good 1,000 hours, so we're not going to play that today, but I do appreciate Film Kid's efforts in trying to get that one squirreled into this episode as well. Anyway, he goes back and says, totally joking, guys. Get your butts back over to episode 110 after you finish listening to this amazing episode for some sweet Sounds of the Classics from Square Enix. Well, that's it for me. Remember, people die and Yuna dances. Hashtag Team Titus. Yes, that is the way you say his name. Anybody who says Titus, meet me outside back in front of the school. Wait, back in front of the school? That's not even a thing. Meet me at the school and we will settle our differences the only way Final Fantasy X manly men can, with a laugh off. I don't know what I'm saying. Anyway, we're going to move on to the next comment from I Am the Dizzle. He says, as someone who has played 5 to 7 hours of every single Final Fantasy game, this is the one that seems like it would annoy me the least. Certainly high praise. Thank you for the comment. And then we go to Deaky Fun, who said, I consider Final Fantasy X to be one of the high points of the series. What stands out most for me is the cohesion between world building, narrative, and the audio-visual design of the game. Much detail and consideration has been poured into all aspects of the storytelling, and I feel like I learn something new each time I revisit the game. I always enjoy learning about the world of Spira, a place beautiful and cruel, both environmentally and theologically. I find the main story well-paced and focused, resolving its mysteries neatly and providing a tragic love story that is one of the better fleshed out and well-realized of the series. Not everything is perfect. The temple puzzles are a bit of a pain. The minigames and side content is the stuff of masochists, and I can say that having dodged 200 lightning bolts at least 4 times in my life. Lulu is a walking manifestation of all the belt-obsessed design tendencies of Tetsuya Nomura, turned up to 11. And you have to fight and listen to Seymour far too many times. But regardless, I really wish Square would go back to making games like these again. Yeah, Square has definitely changed their overall process for creating games. Final Fantasy X is definitely from an era that, for whatever reason, we're not really in anymore as far as how Square creates games. It would be curious to me if they do eventually return to some more of their roots. And then we also had DM4S, who writes and says, I never played Final Fantasy X, but then again, I never played any Final Fantasy between 4 and 13. I know, heresy. But bought the Pixel remasters last year and going through the complete series at the moment. So all the entries between those will come up eventually, as I heard good things about them. Yeah, there are some very good things about many of the Final Fantasy games. I hope you enjoy your Final Fantasy journey. And then finally, Steve writes in and says, I will admit that I have not played any Final Fantasy games, and I need that spark to get into one. Maybe this upcoming episode will do that. Well, Steve, I've got to say, you could certainly pick worse entry points than Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X, it's... I don't want to spoil it. No, I'm not going to spoil it. I'm not going to say what our overall verdict is this early in the episode because we have to get into our actual discussion. So the question is, why? Why Final Fantasy X? I've actually told this story before. I have a little bit of a history with Final Fantasy X myself. Longtime listeners will recall that I have played a good chunk of the earlier Final Fantasy games. I actually got started with the 16-bit Final Fantasy titles. I played Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo, which was really Final Fantasy IV, I believe, in the overall chronology. And then I also played Final Fantasy VI, which was really Final Fantasy III. Well, I'll say Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo, which was really Final Fantasy VI in the overall gameography of the Final Fantasy series, which became one of my favorite games of all time. And then, of course, I played Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9 on the Sony PlayStation 1. And throughout all of these, my brother and I would often play together. And what we would usually do, and I'm not sure if anybody else does this, ISO, I don't know if you ever did this with your brother, but what we used to do is we would sit down and we'd play these massive RPGs with tons of different characters, and we would always voice act. We would actually act out the individual characters. So even if it was female character, male character, animal character, it didn't matter. We came up with different voices for everyone, and I used to love that. We did that all the way from Final Fantasy II in the US, all the way up through Final Fantasy IX. We would do all of the voices. When Final Fantasy X came out on the Sony PlayStation 2, we thought to ourselves, this is a brand new Final Fantasy, and we loved playing Final Fantasy and other Square RPGs, and we thought to ourselves, this is going to be amazing, yet another chance to experience another awesome RPG. We sat down, we put the disc in our PS2, and the first thing we noticed was that there was voice acting? Voice acting in a Final Fantasy game? How is this even going to work? How could I actually act out the characters if the voice acting was doing it for me? I've got to say, that rubbed me the wrong way so badly. I spent a lot of time looking around in the options to try to see if there was a way to turn off the voice work, because all I wanted was the traditional text for a Final Fantasy game. And the text was there, but it was accompanied by voice acting. And I didn't even care about the quality of the voice acting at that point. It was simply the fact that voice acting existed in the first place that turned me off from the game entirely. To put it into perspective, I didn't even get to Spira. when I first played Final Fantasy X. I heard the voice acting in the very opening moments. I saw the blitzball intro where Sin is emerging from the water and Auron is standing there. And so I don't even know that I got past the combat in that very first section before I decided I can't play this game. I can't play it if I can't voice act it. Obviously, today, I'm a little bit different. I play games more by myself than I do necessarily with others. So the voice acting, and we will talk about the voice acting later on, but the voice acting isn't quite as much of an impediment for me today. And when ISO decided to sponsor this episode, I thought to myself, well, you know what? This is actually a good opportunity. This is a good opportunity to go back and correct something that was literally 25 years put off because I just put it aside and I literally never went back to it. It was just one of those things that I couldn't get my head around the voice acting thing. So, of course, for this episode, I did go back, I did play it. I have many thoughts about the game, but that's why I'm really interested in exploring Final Fantasy X and talking through it. And that was why I was really interested when ISO ended up sponsoring this episode. So, ISO, I've got to imagine that because you did pick the game to sponsor, that there's got to be a history there. So what's your history with Final Fantasy X?
Well, while we didn't voice the actors like you and your brother did, we did play Final Fantasy games, me and my brother, quite a lot, to the point where I'm actually not sure how many of them I've finished or how much of it. I remember playing Final Fantasy VII a lot. I remember we rented it for my 12th birthday and we were obsessed with Final Fantasy VII. And I remember we rented it from the video shop because it was a little bit like, it was M, and it was sort of like, oh, you're not 15, but you're allowed to rent it because it's a special birthday, with my friend who was a little bit older. So we rented that, The Matrix, and Coyote Ugly. I don't know if you know that movie, but
I do. It's an odd combination of films, I will say. But yes, I am familiar with the film.
I'll admit, I think the Coyote Ugly might have been for the ladies on the box. My mate might have picked that.
Oh, yeah, it sells. Yeah.
It does sell. The Matrix and Final Fantasy VII left an impression on me, though. So, and my brother, I think. So we ended up buying Final Fantasy VII as a used copy, but I haven't finished Final Fantasy VII. I moved on to Final Fantasy VIII. Again, we played it together. So there's like, sometimes he'd probably play it when I wasn't around, but we'd play it together. And then I skipped 9. The fantasy setting didn't really gel for me. The graphics weren't like, I really like that sort of Neo post, like the Blade Runner-y, like modern interpretation of a fantasy, which 7 and 8 had sort of done and 9 sort of departed from. So I skipped 9. My brother loved it. He just, to this day, is trying to get me to play it. And Final Fantasy X, I remember the first time I ever saw it was at a friend's house. We'd gone over to do some homework, or it was a project we were working on together. And his brother, they had like this upstairs loft area, and it had a couch. It's like the coolest, like this. I don't know if you get this when you were younger, you went to like friends' houses. And, oh, it's so cool! They've got all this different stuff, and like sort of admiring what they've got. And he was just sitting in this upstairs loft. It was like his bean bags and like posters up on the wall, and he was playing Final Fantasy X, the blitzball. He was playing blitzball, and I was like, "What is this? It is so cool!" Like, I wasn't really a big sports kid, but like just seeing that action, and like it was just incredible. When the graphics, because the PS2 had only just come out, and we hadn't got one, we were still working with the PlayStation, and yeah, just seeing that just blew my mind. And then couple of years later, once we got our PS2, which was like about 2 years after the life cycle, we picked this up, and I was obsessed with it. I'm not sure. I know my brother played it with me, but I just remember being so focused on it that it was just me in the room. Even if he was there, he might as well have not been, because I was just so immersed in it. And I got to the end. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I just didn't want it to end. Like, because I was enjoying it so much, and I got to what I now know is probably 5 minutes away from the ending, and I turned it off and never played it again.
You're kidding me. Wait, you literally...
I didn't finish it.
Wow.
Didn't finish it. So I need to correct that for myself, because I held it as one of my favorite games of all time, and everybody would ask me what my favorite Final Fantasy is, and I'd say 10, but I never finished it. And then they go, pretty much your reaction. Why? Why didn't you finish it? You were like, I was at the final battle. And for spoiler reasons, there is a moment that you get to pick something, and I just couldn't do it, and I had to turn it off. And I hadn't finished the side content, so my logic was I'd go back and finish the side content and come back. But again, we'll probably get into it a bit later. That is a massive time commitment. And as a 15-year-old boy with school and stuff like that, I just never made it through. So, yeah, that's why I've picked Final Fantasy X. And because you love voice acting so much, this is probably one of the best examples of voice acting in gaming. So,
Did you just say this is one of the best examples of voice acting in gaming?
Sorry, my Australian accent probably isn't conveying sarcasm. Quite
That's what it is.
Yeah.
I was going to say, because if that was the case, you and I might have different opinions about the voice acting stuff.
Hey, some of it's all right.
Some of it's okay. Sure.
Some of it's really good.
There are occasions throughout we're going to talk about all that later on. But yes, the voice acting, I have some thoughts about the voice acting. So the question is, and then this is the question that was on my mind. Did I really miss an opportunity to play an amazing RPG almost 25 years ago because I couldn't get my head around the voice acting? Or were my initial impressions valid? Does Final Fantasy X truly hold up today? Final Fantasy X is a role-playing game developed and published by Square and released for the Sony PlayStation 2 in 2001, with an HD remaster following in 2013 for the PS Vita and PS3, with a number of ports to other consoles following in later years. Before we can talk about Final Fantasy X, we've got to take a step back and talk about the history of the Final Fantasy series. And what better place to start than all the way back with Final Fantasy I. So I have a confession to make. I have actually never played Final Fantasy I. ISO, have you played Final Fantasy I?
I have not. I've heard a bit about it recently, but I have not heard anything about the history. Well, I know a little bit of the history of it, but I have never played it, no.
So Final Fantasy I is an interesting one. And from what I understand, and once again, I haven't played it, but from what I understand, it is probably one of the more simpler Final Fantasy entries, and that kind of makes sense, being the first one out of the gate. It's really interesting, if we look back at the history, just how it came to be and why it came to be. So if we look around the time Final Fantasy I was originally being made, which is the late 80s, around 1986, 1987, Square, which is the company behind the game, they were actually in a period of time where they were facing some pretty significant financial difficulties. Depending on what source you read, they are listed as potentially being even on the brink of bankruptcy. They were kind of in a similar situation, albeit not totally the same as what Nintendo was facing after they went through that whole radar scope snafu, where they ordered a bunch of radar scope cabinets. They shipped them all over to North America, assuming it was going to be the biggest game out there. And unfortunately, because of shipping logistics and delays, it just never really took off. And by the time Radar Scope was ready to release in North America, nobody was interested. Then Shigeru Miyamoto came around, and he basically retrofitted all of those cabinets, created Donkey Kong, and the rest is history. New mascot was born, and in the process, a superstar in video game history. Square was in a similar kind of situation, a little bit more challenging than what Nintendo was in. Nintendo's snafu could have created significant financial difficulty for the company, but wouldn't necessarily have made the company go out of business. Square was at a point in their history where if they didn't have a hit, they had a real chance of actually going out of business. So there was a call put out to the entire Square team, or at least the entire Square creative team, about trying to create something that would hopefully save the fortunes of the company. So right around this time, there was a game designer by the name of Hironobu Sakaguchi, and he was one of the teammates on the Square creative team. And he had always wanted to create a role-playing game, but at the time, his bosses at the company said basically, no, don't do it. They didn't really have faith that RPGs were going to be big sellers. Now, interestingly, after the release of Dragon Quest a couple years before, the company started to look at things and thought, well, wait a second, maybe RPGs could actually sell. So when Sakaguchi came forward and said, hey, I want to create an RPG, and I think this could potentially turn the overall company, the financial challenges could turn it around, could actually potentially become a success for the company, Square finally relented. They said, okay, you can go off and create this RPG. Just recognize that if it fails, the company might fail along with it. So,
No pressure.
No pressure at all. Absolutely none. So Sakaguchi went off and he started to create Final Fantasy I with a small team of developers and creative talent, and certainly musicians like Nobuo Uematsu, who would become the composer for many of the Final Fantasies, at least up through, I'm not even sure, but certainly well beyond Final Fantasy X, Uematsu was still the composer for the Final Fantasy series. Now, the fact that Final Fantasy was named quote-unquote Final Fantasy is actually important for two different reasons. For one, if it was a failure, it could have very well been the final game that Square ever created. But even beyond that, Sakaguchi at the time was feeling a little disenfranchised with the overall video game industry. He was feeling disenfranchised. He wasn't able to make the games he wanted to make. And he figured that if his idea for this RPG wouldn't actually succeed, then he might actually leave the gaming industry entirely. He was actually thinking about going back to school to return to his studies if Final Fantasy wasn't going to become a success. So very interesting in terms of choosing the word final in Final Fantasy. It kind of was a little prophetic in that if things didn't go well, it would have been the final entry, or I guess the first and final entry for a game series that may have actually not been successful. Now, of course, Final Fantasy I would, in fact, become a success. It would actually sell just about 2 million copies in the years following its release on the Famicom and NES back in 1987, and shortly after its release, a sequel would be greenlit. So, ISO, I've got a question for you. Do you think Sakaguchi ever imagined that this first Final Fantasy, his game that was hopefully this Hail Mary kind of effort, do you think that he ever thought there would actually be a sequel to the game in the future?
I think from what I've heard, it's like everyone afterwards, I don't know whether it was like a mantra for this game series, like treat it like it is the last one. Like don't repeat ideas, don't rest on the successes of the last one. Try something new, balls to the wall. If it works, it works. If not, we've made something that we can be proud of. So look, I don't know whether he thought there would be more, but I think he's treated like each one. And I think that's something you can appreciate from the series too. Like, no one is exactly the same as the next. So obviously there are some common themes and some common DNA there, but everyone's different. And you ask anybody, even take our Discord server, you ask the question, which is the best Final Fantasy? Everybody will have a different one. And I think that's important to sort of recognize that he's treated each of them as their own. So probably not.
Yeah, so
Probably equally impacted.
you're absolutely right. So Sakaguchi didn't even have it in his thoughts at all. He didn't think that there was going to be another Final Fantasy. He looked at Final Fantasy, the very first one, as kind of this standalone thing that was just going to be hopefully a success. But if it was a success, he and the company would go on to other things. It was so successful, though, that Square, shortly after the game came out, would greenlight a sequel. And Sakaguchi, when they came to him and said, okay, start working on the sequel, he started thinking to himself, how the heck am I going to do that? I didn't plan for there to be a sequel in the first place. I didn't design the first game to really be sequel friendly. So because of that, because he didn't really think about creating a sequel when he was creating the first game, that's actually why, when you look at most of the Final Fantasy entries, they all, even though to your point, ISO, they have similar themes, they might have similar monsters or certain recurring characters, even though the characters themselves are different from one game to the next. They might have similar kinds of combat systems, but at the end of the day, every single Final Fantasy game, except for a few exceptions where there were sequels to certain series, but for the most part, most of the Final Fantasy games stand alone, and they are effectively standalone experiences that don't really tie from one to the other. It's interesting that the reason that that even started going down that path is because Sakaguchi originally didn't even think there was going to be a sequel to the first one. So he had no concepts about how to make that first game into something that would be prolonged beyond that very first experience. So with that, Final Fantasy II would, of course, be made. Final Fantasy III on the 8-bit Famicom would also come out as well. The first three Final Fantasies would all be 8-bit affairs before Square would make the leap to Nintendo's brand new 16-bit console, the Super Famicom in Japan, and of course the Super Nintendo Entertainment System everywhere else. Working on Final Fantasies 4 through 6 would all be 16-bit releases. They would all be focused on the Super Nintendo system, or at least the Super Famicom, Super Nintendo 16-bit ecosystem, because not every one of those games would come out internationally. Final Fantasy IV would release in the United States and elsewhere as Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy VI would release in international territories as Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy V would be a Japan exclusive until years later, when it would eventually be localized and released as part of various Final Fantasy collections over the years. But all of those 16-bit releases would all be more popular than the last, with Final Fantasy VI, in the eyes of many and myself, being a high watermark for the series, at least up to that point. Now, as Final Fantasy VI development wrapped up in around 1994, work would begin on conceptualizing the next release in the series, which of course is the game that would eventually be known as Final Fantasy VII. And ISO, you mentioned you do have some experience with Final Fantasy VII from your past, right?
Yeah, definitely played a lot of it. I, again, never finished it. A bit of the same, didn't want it to end, but then sort of petered out because of the amount of time and stuff to finish some of that side content. I have played the remasters. I've played the first remaster. The second remaster part 2 is sitting in some plastic on top of my cupboard with, again, time commitments being an issue. But yeah, a big fan of 7, and I actually quite like 8 as well. So
now, I got a question for you about Final Fantasy VII, because this was a big thing for me, and we'll get into why this happened. But I remember when Final Fantasy VII was announced to be coming to the Sony PlayStation, I was heartbroken because at that point, I was still a Nintendo fanboy. And up to that point, Square had done all of their RPGs they had released for Nintendo systems, and I assumed that Final Fantasy VII would be coming out on a Nintendo system. So when I found out that the sequel to Final Fantasy VI, which was one of my favorite RPGs of all time, was not going to be on my beloved Nintendo ecosystem, I was heartbroken. Did you have a similar kind of situation? I'm not sure how much Final Fantasy you played before Final Fantasy VII, but for me, it was a major shock when Square came out and said that we're not going to support Nintendo, we're actually going to go onto Sony's PlayStation.
Well, before that, that encounter at the video shop on my 12th birthday, I'd actually never heard of it.
Oh, wow.
So, and we didn't have a Super Nintendo. We played Super Nintendos at friends and family's houses, but we didn't have one. Our first console was a Nintendo 64. And then we sort of backtracked to get a PlayStation. So the PlayStation experience of Final Fantasy VII is the only one that we really knew. So I'd heard from people that 6 was as good, if not better, than 7. And I just couldn't believe it. Yeah. I think I'd probably enjoy 6 going back and playing it, because I actually really love a pixel art style. But my first experience was 7, and then obviously moved forward to 8, and then skipped 9 onto 10.
Yeah, so Final Fantasy VII was actually originally going to be a Nintendo title. Square was going to create Final Fantasy VII for Nintendo's brand new next generation console, the Nintendo 64. The issue was that as Square started to work on the game, they realized that Final Fantasy VII, and this was something that they had always intended to do, they always tried to one-up themselves whenever they would make a new Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy became Square's flagship series. So what they wanted to do is every time they made a new iteration or a new entry in that series, they wanted to make sure that they were always doing one better. They were always bettering everything about the games. Final Fantasy VII was envisioned to be this dramatic increase in overall scope and complexity beyond Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VI, in the eyes of many, an amazing game. Final Fantasy VII was going to be light years beyond, and that's really what Square wanted to do when they set off to make the game. Now, when Nintendo made the decision for their Nintendo 64 console to be a cartridge-based system, Square kind of started to think to themselves that this might not actually work for the scope and size and complexity that they wanted to build within Final Fantasy VII. At the time, they started working with Nintendo, and Nintendo said, well, hey, we also have this 64DD add-on, which was a digital disc add-on, which basically made it so that there was additional storage available for the Nintendo 64. Nintendo 64 cartridges could hold a fair amount of storage, but the issue was making cartridges around this time, and this is something that was pervasive across the industry even before the N64, but making cartridges was expensive, much more expensive than the newer or relatively newer CD-ROM technology that was making waves across the entire industry. So what ended up happening was Final Fantasy VII was in development. Square planned to bring it to the Nintendo 64 with the 64DD add-on, so that was intended to be the way that Square was going to be able to overcome the storage limitations of the console, or of the cartridge-based console, and try to bring a much larger, varied scope and world to life. The issue was that even with the 64DD, and by the way, each of those discs held 64 megabytes of information. As Square started working on the game and they started to conceptualize what the game would look like, which would include pre-rendered graphics with 3D characters kind of superimposed on those backgrounds, the graphics were advanced. They had pre-rendered animated cutscenes. They wanted to do advanced music. As they started to create Final Fantasy VII and all of the pieces started to come together, they recognized that trying to fit this all, even within the confines of the 64DD, was just not going to happen. And in fact, at one point, before Final Fantasy VII shifted development over to the Sony PlayStation, it was going to take over 30 64DD discs if it came out on the Nintendo 64. Now, we've talked a little bit about disc swapping in prior episodes of the podcast. I cannot imagine what it would have been like to buy a game and get 30 discs that I would have to swap between as I played the game. It would have been absolutely crazy if that would have happened.
Imagine if you lost one. You lost one. You might just borrow it. Can I borrow this 13?
Right, exactly.
You can't have that one.
It's like the old Monkey Island joke where it says,
"Oh, I love that."
Well, what was it? Please insert what disc? I can't remember the number.
It was like 39 or something. I can't remember. I do know the joke, but yeah, I can't remember the specific number. I actually, that really confused me because I think they reference it in 4 as well, and Monkey Island 4.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I was like, what is this? I don't get it. And then it was only like after I realized it was, like a floppy disk joke,
Yeah, I can only imagine what buying. I can't even imagine actually what that box would have looked like with 30 discs in it for Final Fantasy VII. It would have been massive, and I've got to believe that it would have cost. Yeah, exactly. I got to believe it would have cost a significant amount of money just to press those discs, let alone the whole, I know Square was concerned about the cost of the cartridges, but 30 individual 64 DD discs for each copy of Final Fantasy VII would have been insane. So Square decided at that point that a change was in order. So they decided to, instead of going with Nintendo, which was the company they had worked with for years, they decided to switch over and go with the newly launched Sony PlayStation platform, using CD technology that was cheaper and offered more storage. It felt like a win-win for the company, and the rest, as they say, is history. Final Fantasy VII would come out on the Sony PS1, as would Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX, and all of them would be critically and commercially successful, to the tune of millions of copies for each game sold. In fact, Final Fantasy VII would end up being one of the most sold games of all time, at least around that time, with over 14 million copies sold. I can't imagine that would have been the case if Square had decided to stay with Nintendo and their relatively limited storage technology. So ultimately, sounds like Square made the right choice. But I got to tell you, from a personal perspective, it did sting. Even though I would jump on the Sony PlayStation bandwagon, it definitely stung to no longer have Square on my beloved Nintendo consoles.
But just think about like Sony, like how much of a boon that was. Like that was such a massive game. Like it like even when I wasn't around it, like the massive pop culture phenomenon of Final Fantasy VII was just outrageous. Like everybody knew about it, and it just blew up.
Well, yeah, and it set Sony up really well for continuing to expand the PlayStation ecosystem itself. It was one of their biggest sellers. It was truly, you're right, it was a pop culture phenomenon. I mean, Final Fantasy VII would even come out on the Windows platform. I actually have a copy of it. I haven't played it on Windows, but I have a copy of it for Windows, and it was pervasive. But it really did. It put Sony on the map. And the fact is that Final Fantasy VII had such a more mature, I'll say it had a more mature story, or it had I'll say a deeper story in terms of the plot twist, which I'm not going to spoil here, but if you know, you know. It was heartbreaking itself. But otherwise, I mean, yes, you're right. Final Fantasy VII was a big deal for Sony.
Well, I'm not even sure if that's the first time I saw blood. Like the bit where Sephiroth goes through the Shinra building. Like
yeah.
That scene there. Yeah, I reckon that was probably one of the first in-game parts of gore that I saw as a kid. It was just like, I remember that sticking out. It was like it's very adult in terms of the content.
Yeah, and I think the fact that the PlayStation had more graphical capabilities than the 16-bit consoles, at least, really allowed Square to push the envelope a bit, at least graphically. I mean, you had in other Final Fantasy games, there were characters that were killed and deaths that happened, but because it was all the 16-bit pixel art kind of style, you didn't really have that same level of viscera, or you didn't have that same degree of being able to convey all of that visually. Whereas with Final Fantasy VII and even beyond, on the PlayStation 1, it was just something that they were able to push it, and for better or worse, I mean, I think that definitely signaled that this was a new era for Final Fantasy games. So obviously, Final Fantasy VII through Final Fantasy IX would be major successes for the Sony PlayStation 1. Eventually, Sony would move on to their next console, the PS2, and with that shift, so too did Square move their Final Fantasy franchise onto Sony's new, more powerful machine, which would eventually result in the creation of Final Fantasy X. Now, the team decided to do some different things with Final Fantasy X. As we were talking about, every time Square made a new Final Fantasy game, they really wanted to change things up. They didn't want to do the same thing over and over again. There were certain elements and certain mechanics that would be the same across games, but for the most part, every single Final Fantasy game was intended to be a brand new experience. So for Final Fantasy X, there were a few changes. We're going to talk about these more in a little bit. But there were a few changes that the team really focused on in order to make Final Fantasy X a unique experience and also take advantage of the brand new power that came along with the PlayStation 2, which was dramatically more powerful than the original PlayStation and many of the other consoles that were on the market at the time. One of the ways that Square intended to really utilize the power of the system was that for Final Fantasy X, For the first time in a Final Fantasy game, everything would be 3D. In the past, starting with Final Fantasy VII, the way that Square would usually create their games is they would create pre-rendered backgrounds, but those backgrounds would effectively be flat. Now, through clever perspective and graphics tricks, they would basically take 3D polygonal characters and they would mesh them with the backgrounds. So in different Final Fantasy games, you might be walking into the scene and you might see your character get smaller as you walked into the scene, which created the illusion of three-dimensional movement. But in reality, it was just a clever graphics trick where the characters would be scaling, the characters were in 3D, but the backgrounds were actually just images, or images with some overlaid graphics with them, but it wasn't a true 3D environment. With Final Fantasy X, the intent was to make a fully three-dimensional game, meaning characters and environments, for the first time, would be fully rendered in 3 dimensions. The team also wanted to introduce a different mechanism for experience and progression. They introduced something that they called the sphere grid system, which I'm not going to talk about at all right now because we're going to dive pretty deep into the sphere grid system in a little bit. But suffice it to say, this was a very different form of progression beyond what you would have in many of the other Final Fantasy games that had come out up to this point. Final Fantasy X would also be the first time that series composer Nobuo Uematsu wouldn't be the sole person working on the music. For this title, he would be joined by Masashi Hamauzu and Junya Nakano, both of whom were chosen because their musical stylings were thought to complement Uematsu's work. And it's interesting, if you listen to the soundtrack, and we're actually, a little bit of a spoiler, we're going to have a full Sounds of the Classics episode on Final Fantasy X music because it is so good and also because it's just so varied. But if you listen to the soundtrack, you can kind of tell the stylistic differences between the different composers. Uematsu has a very distinct style, and if anybody has played the earlier Final Fantasy games, you can pretty easily pick out which tracks in Final Fantasy X, or you can at least guess with reasonable certainty which tracks in Final Fantasy X belonged to Uematsu. As you listen to the other tracks, you'll start to be able to pick out the different stylistic differences that you would be able to attribute to one versus another composer. So it's kind of interesting. And ISO, I know we'll talk about music later on. Did you kind of notice that stylistic difference as you played the game between the music and the different tracks?
It's so funny, like doing the research for this, I sort of realized that there was, was it 3 or 4 composers that sort of come in on this? And all of my favorites were actually one composer. Like most of my favorite ones were a different composer. I'm not sure his name, but the guy that did the Besaid, like a lot of the ambient style music, so the ones that play in Besaid and the Thunder Plains and all that sort of stuff, it's just so incredible, and it does actually complement the game to have those different composers like sort of jumping in, because as you also mentioned, that runs the gamut of different styles. Like you've got jazz, you've got instrumental ambience, you've got electric, punk, metal. It's all over the place. It's a really beautiful soundtrack, and I think we'll talk about that more. But it's incredible.
Yeah, I was actually, when I played the game, I was most shocked by the heavy metal track that accompanied the blitzball opening, and it's also played later in the game for the one battle. But I was like, wait a second, that's not Final Fantasy. My first reaction was, that's not Final Fantasy. Like that doesn't.
It's kicking the teeth, isn't it? Really, like, and it really does sort of like that punch in the guts to start off that this isn't your dad's Final Fantasy. We're going into the new era, new PS2. We've got these brand new graphics and CGI cutscene, and here's a full metal track that you wouldn't think matches the game at all, but it does fit in really nicely.
Yeah, it was definitely a shock, but you're absolutely right. I think that was a conscious decision that basically said, look, this is something new. This is a brand new experience, and you better strap in because you're about to experience something truly unforgettable. Now, one of the other biggest changes that came about with Final Fantasy X, and we kind of alluded to it earlier, and we're going to talk about it more later, is the fact that Square decided to include voice acting in the game, which was a first for a Final Fantasy title. Even though Final Fantasy 7 through 9 were CD-based games, there was no voice acting. There were still just text boxes on the screen for every single character in the game. With Final Fantasy X, voice acting would be included for many of the main characters. Not necessarily everything. There were still some parts and some of the smaller scale characters that just had text boxes that popped up. Basically, the incidental characters still had text boxes. But if you were any degree, certainly if you were a main character, and many of the side characters, but still ones that had some degree of prominence, they were all voice acted. And we'll talk about the quality of the voice acting in a little bit. But the original intent behind including voice acting in the game was to create more emotion and feeling than what text could convey alone, which honestly kind of makes sense because a lot of times when you read the written word, it's got to be written in a certain way in order to make you actually feel something. A lot of times text does not convey emotion. But the thought was that by including voice acting in Final Fantasy X, you'd be able to have a more emotional impact with the overall game. Now, interestingly, it also led to a little bit of a side effect. When the voice acting was being created, the Japanese team wanted to lip sync all of the animated characters with the voice work. They wanted to make it feel as though the characters in the game were actually speaking the dialogue that was recorded for them. So the Japanese team did just that. They did all of the lip syncing and they synced up all of the animations with the recorded dialogue. Now, the issue is that when the North American team went to localize the game for English, they discovered that they couldn't actually rework the lip syncing. They weren't allowed to change the animations for the lip syncing. Instead, what they had to do was actually retrofit the script to match the length of the Japanese lip synced animations. And this is something where if they had a line of dialogue that exceeded the overall length of the animated lip syncing, the game would actually crash. So they had to basically go into the script and they had to make the script either longer or shorter in order to match the original Japanese animated lip sync animations. Now that led to the inclusion of some filler words in certain situations, some relatively rushed lines in others. Sometimes just the pacing of the dialogue felt just a little weird. And generally there was just some awkwardness in the delivery of some of the dialogue throughout the game. That wasn't actually the fault of the actors. It was actually because this whole lip syncing issue existed. And if they didn't do that, the game would basically not run. So I found that interesting, something that you don't always think about, because I would have assumed that with something like this, you would just redo the lip syncing. You'd redo the animations, and then you would match it with whatever dialogue or whatever language that you were trying to use. Didn't happen.
Well, I had sort of assumed it was a translational issue until I heard that. It was a limitation of the, as you said, it was a limitation that they had to work to. So, I mean, I felt like I forgived it a little bit. I don't know if that's how you ended up falling on this, but yeah, I definitely, when I originally played it, I thought it was just bad translation. And yeah, it totally wasn't that. It was, yeah, the limitations.
Yeah, I'm with you. I thought that it was just a bad translation. It was one of those, it was kind of like some of the older Japanese animated films or television shows where the English dubbing might not have been all that great, or the translation might not have been all that great. I just assumed it was the same kind of thing originally. But then when I realized that it was actually a technical limitation, I will say that I gave them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, at least for the North American version. But it was one of those things where when I first heard the voice acting and saw some of the dialogue and the lines, and it felt a little bit.
It's still bad.
I mean, it's still. Listen, I'm gonna give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, but I'm not giving them a free pass because we're going to talk about that. But regardless of that challenge, the rest of Final Fantasy X's development would largely be uneventful. though I will say it was truly a triple A production. If you look at the overall budget in today's dollars, it was around $61 million set aside to create Final Fantasy X. There was a team of over 100 people working on the title. Final Fantasy X would end up being one of the most expensive games ever developed at the time of its release, and it would eventually release on the market in 2001. The question on Square's minds and on everyone's mind was, would that level of investment actually be worth it, especially considering that the PS2 install base at the time wasn't nearly as pervasive as the PS1 before it, or at least not yet, because the PS2 had just came out literally 1 year before Final Fantasy X's release. So, would Final Fantasy X actually be worth that level of investment? The short answer is yes, it would, as it would become universally beloved and critically acclaimed. It would win countless Best RPG and Game of the Year awards, would be included in numerous Best Games of All Time lists, and would commercially exceed every expectation placed upon it. To put it into perspective, Square expected the game to sell maybe around 2 million copies worldwide. They didn't really have high expectations. I mean, 2 million copies sold is still a hit. But Square didn't really expect it to exceed that number. They thought around 2 million copies, given the PS2's limited install base, that would be good enough for them. Well, it turns out that Final Fantasy X would end up selling over 2 million copies in its first day of release alone. 1 million copies were sold in a matter of hours. It would become the fastest selling PS2 game at the time, being the first to reach 2 million and 4 million copies sold, and would end its life having sold over 8 million copies, which was, by all measures, a huge success. Final Fantasy X's legacy continues to be felt even today, as the HD remaster would be released in 2013 and would be ported to a number of systems over the years. So much so that today, Final Fantasy X is available pretty much on any modern console, as it continues to gain more and more fans around the world. It would also be the first Final Fantasy game to get an actual sequel, though the story behind that game is a story for a different day. The bottom line is that Final Fantasy X would end up being yet another stellar entry in the Final Fantasy series, and in the eyes of many, represented the pinnacle of JRPG perfection at the time of its release. The question on my mind, though, is does Final Fantasy X still hold up today? We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Final Fantasy X today versus when it was released almost 25 years ago. So Final Fantasy X, at its core, is a fairly traditional Japanese role-playing game, along with most of the mechanics that many JRPGs are known for. You have a very large, and often deep narrative kind of experience. The narrative in a JRPG is often one of the major focus areas, but it is not the only focus area. Most JRPGs are featured with menu-driven combat and item management as well as skill usage. It is a very menu-driven kind of affair. Combat oftentimes happens randomly as you're exploring various locations. That combat is almost always turn-based in some capacity. There have been different games that play around with pseudo-real-time mechanics, and certainly even some of the prior Final Fantasy games have played around with pseudo-real-time mechanics. Final Fantasy X, by the way, is purely a turn-based kind of affair. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Of course, in addition to those random encounters, there are also bosses that you have to fight along the way. A lot of times the games will focus a great degree of exploration. The story will be expanded over a course of tens of hours, if not longer. You'll gain tons of different equipment and experience along the way, all en route to eventually beating the game. So that is kind of the traditional JRPG kind of style. And I mention that to say that Final Fantasy X is, for all intents and purposes, a JRPG. All of those features are prevalent within Final Fantasy X. But there are also a number of things that Final Fantasy X does differently to set itself apart, both from prior Final Fantasy games as well as other JRPGs in general. So, we have a lot to talk about as it relates to Final Fantasy X. Before we get into more of the mechanics, though, I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about the characters that belong to the Final Fantasy X universe, because oftentimes with JRPGs, you will have a huge number of companions that you could potentially recruit along the way. Some games allow you to recruit more companions than what you can possibly use in an individual party at one time, whereas others are a little bit more focused. For Final Fantasy X, you have around 7-ish characters that you can recruit over the course of your playthrough, and at any point in time, you can use 3 of them in your party. So let's talk through the characters, and I'm sure that ISO and I are going to have some similarities in our list of characters and what we, or who we think are good to use or interesting, and probably some differences as far as some characters that I might like or dislike, and ISO might like or dislike. So let's talk through all the characters. I'm going to name a name.
You're going to start with your favorite, aren't you? You're going to start with Titus?
I'm going to start with Titus, because Titus is the main guy. So we're going to start with Titus, whether I like him or not. We're going to start with Titus. I want you to give me your opinion on Titus first, before I give you my opinion.
I am not 100% sure if it's Stockholm Syndrome or not, but by the end of it, I quite like him. I think he becomes endearing throughout the course of I think story does a lot for it. And I think a lot of it is like retroactively thinking about it. In the moment, you think he's a little whiny bitch most of the time. And then I think what really does save it is the voiceovers. So when Titus speaks, he usually says any number of absolute stupid lines. And then he'll usually do a voiceover where it's like panning over scenery or something, and he'll say something quite profound, and it sort of makes up for it. I don't know if it forgives it 100% of the time, but I actually started to really like him in the end. So
I will say you said one thing that I 100% agree with, and that is that Titus is a whiny bitch. I 100% agree with you in that assessment. Now, in all seriousness, I will say that I started to like Titus more as the story went on. And actually, I wrote down in my notebook when Titus stopped being such a whiny bitch and started to be a little bit more appealing. It was 25 hours in. I literally took a note. It was 25 hours, and I wrote in my notebook.
Was it under Macalania Temple? Was that?
It was, let me see, this was after, oh geez, where was this? It was definitely... It was after you realize, this is a spoiler alert. I can't say this one.
Yeah. Sorry.
It was okay. I'll say this. It was right after you get on the airship for the first time. Not the later airship stuff, but when you first get on the airship. So that was for me around the 25-hour mark, and I wrote.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And I wrote in my notebook, and finally, Titus stopped sounding like a bitch. Now. I will say that he returned to it after that. But around 25 hours, that's when I finally started to look at Titus, and I thought, okay, I'm okay. I'm getting behind it a little bit. I'm getting behind him. I'm kind of understanding his general demeanor and stuff. So to your point, by the time you reach the end of the game, I wasn't quite as down on Titus, but I will say that for a good chunk of the game, I was I was not feeling him. Now, I
Oh,
will
they call
say,
it an arc, mate. You gotta hate him to love him. That's how it works.
is
It's a
that how it
character
works?
arc.
Because if so,
Yeah, that's how it works.
they achieved what they wanted to do then,
Half of
because
the arc.
I definitely hated him before I loved him. Although I will say the next character on my list I loved from the beginning, and that was Aaron. I thought
Yeah, he is the best.
he is a beast in battle. He is the coolest character in the entire game. I would play a game with Aaron as the main character. Like he was so cool. And even the voice acting. We'll talk more about voice acting. Aaron was the one voice acted part. Well, I bet there's a couple, but one of the voice acted parts where I thought it was consistently high quality. I didn't really have any issues with his performance.
He has maybe one line that is not in the right context, but otherwise perfect. Like it's fantastic, his voice acting, and I think the way that he's presented in the story is just amazing. Like he almost has a reverse arc. Like you think he's fantastic, and then through flashbacks you sort of see a lot of his story sort of go the other way. Like you sort of see the character he was beforehand, and that's an interesting sort of arc as well. But yeah, definitely there's so much to dive into. He's like a Ronin sort of archetype, so like samurai, and I think the coolest thing is how he keeps one of his arms in a sling, and it's just cool. And sunglasses and grey hair poking out, and no nonsense attitude. And he's the character that sort of knows a lot. He's like one of the wise elder sort of archetypes, where he seems to know a little bit more than he's letting on a lot of the time, and sort of progresses the story that way a lot. But it's a really interesting contrast to some of the other characters.
Yeah, I loved him. I thought Aaron was great. Kamari, I enjoyed too. Although I will say, and this was probably just my own play style, I did not play as Kamari all that much. I actually liked the voice acting. It was a different kind
Where
of
he
role.
doesn't speak.
Yeah, he doesn't speak much, so I mean that was all automatically a bonus. But I liked Kamari, and I liked the concept behind him, and I liked the whole what was his race called?
The Ronso.
The Ronso. I liked that whole lore around that. I liked how that all played into the story. I just, for whatever reason, he didn't really gel with my party, at least as far as the progression that I had worked with them. So he ultimately ended up being one of my lesser used characters. But as a character himself, I actually kind of liked him.
Yeah, he's a really interesting one, and I think he sort of gets stuck in, like, for those that haven't played, he's the blue mage, but he also fits the Swiss Army knife. He starts in, we'll talk about sphere grid a bit later, but he actually starts in the middle, so he can actually move around the sphere grid a lot. So he doesn't really fit any specific play type. So you can sort of have him become your secondary black mage, or you can have him be a DPS, or you can have him be a healer. And because of that, he actually gets a little bit handcuffed because he's not as good as your main black mage, but he's also useful. But as Tony sort of alludes to, he becomes sort of useless towards the later part of the game because he's not as good as your main one. So why would you use him? And he's your backup whether you lose, say you Lulu, you lose. I typically make him black mage as a backup for Lulu, and yeah, it's just a bit of that syndrome where he just sort of loses a bit of power towards the end game. But there is a moment in the story which I think is fantastic. He gets a little spotlight on him, and yeah, I agree with you. His storyline is quite interesting for an understated character. Like, he seems pretty one-dimensional to start with, and then it sort of really does get fleshed out.
Yeah, and that story moment, I think I know exactly what story moment you're talking about. And of course, no spoilers, but I agree with you. That was a really cool moment. that happens. And I appreciated him getting a little bit of a spotlight there, because up to that point, he was really kind of a side character, side/background kind of character. And having a little bit of an opportunity to learn more about him and to have him have an opportunity to show off, so to speak, was nice.
Yeah, he does become very one note at the start because he's the guardian, the sort of guardian figure in Yuna's life, and yeah, all he sort of does is protect and put up a gruff front. But yeah, he does get expanded upon, which is really nice to see.
So then next, after Kamari, I have Yuna on my list. And by the way, this is not in any sort of order. It's just the order that I put it down here. So Yuna for me was, I'll say, one of my preferred characters. I'll say that in general, when I made my party, a lot of times it was Titus, Aaron, Yuna, and one other character that we'll be talking about in a little bit. But Yuna served my healer kind of role. And I think that's kind of what her default class would be. Interestingly, late in the game, I did end up speccing her into more of the Black Mage kind of combat to complement Lulu, who we'll talk about in a little bit, because eventually you get to a point where you, at least for me, I had to do a lot of damage and I wanted to do a lot of damage. So I kind of dual spec'd her between healing and more of that damage dealer kind of mage. But I liked Yuna. I liked the concept behind Yuna more than I liked the voice acting. Although I will say that Yuna's performance is probably the most hit or miss, because there was some of Yuna's lines were great, and then other times it felt like you were watching a really poor high school amateur play to me.
It really does. It goes left to right really quickly too. Like even in the same cutscene, like she'll deliver a really beautiful line and then it will just all fall apart. It's amazing how she can have such contrast. Yeah. I totally agree with you. Hit and miss. The character, the story, and what she represents is very important and beautiful, and I think really well written. Just the voice acting sort of lets it down more often than not, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I didn't remember that. I remember her being a really great character when I played it when I was 15. I remember idolizing her. I thought she was a great character. And only on this replay, I'm like, oh God, her voice acting is probably the worst of the bunch, to be real honest. So.
Now, I'll tell you whose voice acting was actually really good, in my opinion, and that was Waka. Waka was the heart of my group. And I didn't use him in the late game as much. My late game party was, like I said, Titus, Aaron, Yuna, and then Lulu. But Waka was all heart most of the game. I really enjoyed his story arc and how he progressed from his original beliefs throughout the course of the story into eventually becoming much different than what he originally was. And I liked everything about him. He was my bro. He's the guy that I'd go out to the pub and have a couple of beers with and talk about blitzball for hours. Like that's my picture of Waka in my head.
Well, he's your window into the world, isn't he? We haven't spoken about the story yet, but essentially you're a fish out of water character as Titus, and he's introduced into this world where he doesn't really know. There's a couple of characters he does meet early on, but Waka is really your gateway in. Like, yeah, come on, join the world. Like, he's got a positive attitude, very Australian sort of. I don't know. I guess that's sort of a little bit stereotypical, but he does seem like a typical Australian. You know, let's go watch the football and grab a beer and no worries. But he's got a very strong belief system, which really propels the story as well. So, and yeah, his arc's really quite interesting.
Yeah. And then I have Riku, and Riku I really liked, but I ultimately used probably the least out of any character that I had. I don't know if that was because you get Riku a little bit later after some of your characters are already relatively well developed. And I never really used her to any great effect. Although I will say that I did use her special abilities like Steel. I used a fair amount, and I used the what was it? The one potion, the Albed potion, or the whatever it was. There were
Yeah,
certain,
Albert.
yeah, there were certain combat encounters that I found that switching her in, and we'll talk about the whole combat system in a little bit, but I found switching her in at certain points really did help with some of the encounters. But ultimately, at the end of the game, she was probably my weakest and least developed character. And I've heard that she can actually be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, she actually can. It'll be interesting to see how our usages of characters like during the main story and the post game, because actually, yeah, Waka becomes overpowered to a point. Like he's your main damage dealer. He does so much damage. Riku, her overdrive is just completely bonkers once you know what items to farm and grab, and her utility is fantastic. And yeah, the stealing ability, you just build up all these items. So she becomes really useful. But yeah, as you say, because she's introduced quite late to the party, she sort of becomes quite useless, and you got to build her up. And as a character, I find her really interesting. I loved her when I was a 15-year-old. I thought she was one of the better characters. Her character sort of grated on me a little bit this playthrough. I don't know, because she's supposed to be a bit younger than the rest of the party, whether that naivety sort of doesn't mesh as well, or that's a good contrast. I guess it's probably the mix of the different things probably does make it more interesting.
Yeah, I will say I agree with you that she wasn't 100% irritating, but she definitely was
She got
kind
there
of,
sometimes.
yeah, she was not my, I liked her, but I also thought that she could be a little bit grating at times. To your point, I think that was a great way to explain it. That's definitely the way I felt as I played, and as I saw different cutscenes with her in it. I appreciated the character, but she was also a little bit like, I don't know. It wasn't my favorite, let's say. And then we come to Lulu. And I will say that Lulu, personally for me, was a little bit of a roller coaster, where at the very beginning of the game, I thought, wow, I do not like you at all. And I thought that even the acting wasn't all that great. But then as her arc progressed and as the game progressed, Lulu became one of my favorite characters, and she became a mainstay in my party. The three characters that I'll say the two characters that I almost always had in my party were Aaron and Lulu. I used Aaron for melee damage. I used Lulu for magic damage. And Aaron, I used some of his special abilities to improve both. With the whole break system, where you could use mental break to improve the magic damage for Lulu, and then power break, or armor break, to improve the melee damage for Aaron. And if I had Titus in my party as well, that would improve for him. Or later on in the game, when I had Yuna with some dual spec damage, I would be able to enjoy the mental break part. So Aaron and Lulu became probably the most mainstays. They certainly, by the end of my playthrough, were the most developed characters. I just found that they served the same kind of purpose from a damage perspective, albeit with a different kind of damage. So that if you were in a battle where melee was significant, I had Aaron. If there was a battle that magic was significant, I had Lulu. So they were always there, and the third spot was kind of rotating between Titus and Yuna, and occasionally some of the other characters. But ultimately, I ended up liking Lulu, and especially once you progress in her sphere grid and you get double cast and some of the Aga spells like Firaga and Thunder Aga and stuff like that. Or is it Thunder Aga or Thundaga? Whatever it is. It's but once you get the
actually
Aga,
a fourth one, there's a Jaga as well, believe it or not.
What? Wait, what?
Well, you can't get it as a character, but some of the Aeons have Jaga. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're going to have to fill us in on that one, because I did not progress. I did not progress that far, even with the Aeons, to get to that level of spell proficiency. But Lulu was a powerhouse for me. I really enjoyed using her.
She fills a lot of roles, doesn't she? Like, she's your mother figure. She's a love interest at some point as well. It's a really weird mix. Like, she fills a lot of roles. Like, she's sort of the main, for want of a better term, she's the one that explains things to the main character more often than not. Because, again, fish out of water character, she's the one saying, you should know this, but this is why we do this at this temple. blah, 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 blah. She tends to fill in a lot of the mothery sort of role. But as a player character, like the way that she actually works in combat, she's really useful in the early game because she's got access to the magic spells, and she really does burn some of the fiends early in the game. So she's a very interesting character, and yeah, I think she is sort of a frosty exterior, which is part of her character, which then sort of warms up. So I sound like a broken record without spoiling anything, but there is a lot of growth in these characters, which is really interesting to see, like for a game this old.
Yeah, I would say in general, I think that this was, for the time it was released, this has got to be one of the games that had the most character progression, just in terms of the overall arc, personalities, their overall thoughts on things, their perspectives. This felt like every single character had a chance to go through their own personal arcs. Not all of them were as significantly focused as others, but every single one in the game, as I'm looking down the list, every single character had their own arc that they went through. Some were epic, some were more personal and introspective, but regardless, they all had a chance to shine. And regardless of whether I liked a character or didn't like a character, I did appreciate the fact that the game allowed each of them to shine and each of them to grow in their own way over the course of the game.
Did you feel like they needed an extra character?
You know, now that you mention it, maybe. I don't know what role another character would have played, but I will say that early in the game, Titus, Aaron, Kamari, Waka, Lulu, those 5 felt, or I'm sorry, I missed Yuna. Those 6 felt well introduced. And I know that Riku you actually get introduced to relatively early in the game.
He's actually the first one you meet.
Yeah. But the weird thing is that when Riku shows back up later in the game, it felt, I don't know, it felt a little bit unnecessary, or maybe just kind of odd to show up. And I understand the story reasons why that happened, but I guess my point is I would either have dropped to 6 characters, or I would have added an extra character and had a better progression in terms of introducing the characters. Because it's like you get a bunch of characters relatively quickly, and then there's a long gap, and then you finally get Riku, who is your last character that you recruit, and it just feels like there's a little bit too much of a gap there. So if you're going to keep Riku, I think you need to have another character to bridge the gap so that it feels a little bit more, I don't know what the right word is, but connected. It doesn't feel quite as random when it happens. At least that's kind of my perspective.
There was an opportunity they could have introduced her earlier to the main story too, which I'm sort of surprised that they didn't. Without spoiling anything, there's the big town called Luca. She could have been introduced there rather than where she is, and I thought that it would have made more sense maybe. Because I agree. Like, there's a big stretch where she's not there, and then she's introduced, and it's sort of like, oh, okay, well now she's sort of under level, and yeah, you're sort of playing catch up a little bit.
Yeah, but I do find it interesting that based on your playthrough, Riku can actually become incredibly powerful, which she was nowhere near that level of power in my playthrough.
Yeah, I imagine that would really struggle. Like, what reason would you have to have her in your party if she's just going to fall over?
Right, exactly. So those are the characters. Those are the characters that we played with throughout the entirety of Final Fantasy X. I do want to talk a little bit about what Final Fantasy X does differently from other JRPGs and other Final Fantasy games, because there are a number of things that Final Fantasy X did to mix up the overall formula of what a Final Fantasy experience really was. And I want to start by talking about the experience system in the game. So in Final Fantasy X, there are no quote-unquote levels. It's not like when you gain experience, you're going to go from a level 17 Titus to a level 18 Titus. What they have instead is this concept of a sphere grid. The sphere grid is effectively the main way that you're going to get progression for your characters. That's where you're going to unlock new skills. That's where you're going to unlock new or attribute additions, so additional strength or magic or defense, those kinds of things. That's where you're going to be able to get brand new spells for characters that you want to use spells for. I will say that the general layout of the sphere grid was very confusing to me at first, having never played Final Fantasy X before, other than, like I said, just getting up to the intro and then turning it off when I was younger. But going back to play it now, the sphere grid was really confusing for, I would say, maybe a good couple hours at the beginning of the game when I first got access to it. And then it started to become second nature, and I understood how things map together and how the different spheres that had locks on them were able to be bypassed in order to progress, and the whole concept of speccing your characters into certain abilities and even multi-speccing depending on what you wanted to do. So I did eventually overcome that, and actually now, looking back on it, I think the sphere grid was absolutely a genius way of having skills and attributes be assignable to different characters, and the way that each character could traverse the sphere grid themselves and have different things that were part of what I would call their main path versus the side paths that you could unlock as you progress throughout the game and gain additional abilities. I think it was really awesome the way it came together, but I will say that my initial impression was feeling almost a little overwhelmed. And that's just talking about the standard sphere grid. So Iso, you're going to have to help me on this one. First of all, I want to hear what you think about the sphere grid. But secondly, I would love you to explain the difference between the standard sphere grid and the expert sphere grid, because I honestly don't know what the difference is, and I have only played with the standard one.
So yeah, it's quite interesting. So the sphere grid itself, as you sort of alluded to, it's like a massive mandala, if you can sort of picture that in your head. It's like a big grid of different abilities, and you can get plus strength and different abilities like your steel, your different magic abilities, and that's all fixed. So that doesn't move. That's all the same, and all the characters run on the same grid, but they're all in different positions. So if you imagine a big poster and you've got all of your characters essentially in different corners of the map, they all can go wherever they want, but they all have to follow the path that is being assigned. So the basic sphere grid essentially has more blank spaces. So as you play through the game, you can actually get strength spheres, magic spheres, and you can actually add that to the mandala to add your own node. So if you want to build more strength in a certain character, you can then add these rewards that you win in battle, and then add that to the mandala. So any character that adds that to the place that they are gets that buff, and then any character that will then go through that track will then get that buff as well. So the advanced grid, essentially, I actually played on the basic grid as well. I didn't actually play on the advanced grid, but essentially it mixes that up. So characters that would learn certain abilities on a standard playthrough, it actually sort of mixes it up a bit. I think it's more for repeat players, and I think it's sort of more geared for breaking the system. So the sphere grid, while there is room to sort of mix and match, you like make your own decisions and move characters in certain ways, it is sort of tied to one specific path. Like each character has their own path, and then towards the end of the game, they can then divert more. The advanced sphere grid is more for diverting earlier. And it's completely different. It's like you look at it'd be worth looking up, Tony, the difference between the grids, because there's a big stretches, and like where the basic sphere grid's very circular, the advanced sphere grid's very linear, and there's like big jumps and lines, and it's less. There are less nodes in the advanced sphere grid, which is why a lot of players actually say that the basic sphere grid's better for the end game, because you've got a lot more empty spaces to add those extra spheres, as I was just explaining.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that there was actually a difference in the number of nodes on the grid on the advanced versus the standard.
Yeah, so actually in the later game, you can get clear spheres as well. So you can actually delete nodes. So you can then fill them up. So you can do a full path of strength or HP, and delete the nodes that are, because you get varying degrees. So you can get like a +4 or a +1. So you can delete the +1s and then place +4s in there. And then that's what we call stat maxing. So
wow, when we start talking about the end game stuff, this is going to be like an entirely new language to me. because I did not I did not do anything with the end game content. I basically played the mainline story. It took me around 50-ish hours, probably a little bit over 50 hours if you include some of the deaths and restarts on some of the harder encounters. But I did not touch the end game content. And ISO, I know you devoured the end game content. So once we get there, I am very curious to hear your thoughts, because just hearing about deleting sphere grid nodes and then augmenting them with higher powered nodes in order to be able to really max out the stats, I would have never even thought that was a thing. I don't think in my entire playthrough, I don't think I got anything that was like a clear grid or a clear stone or whatever it was called. I don't think I encountered that at all in my playthrough.
No, that's very late game, pretty much at the end where it's almost worthless. But that is an issue that I have with the game. A lot of this stuff is introduced sort of too late, little bit past when you probably need it. And then it'd be worth mentioning, I actually played the remaster and Tony's played the original. So I'm not sure if there is minute differences between the two copies, but as far as I'm aware from my research, that they're pretty similar. So there are full YouTube channels where you can just look at how people have completely maximized the runs on this to minimize the amount of time. So Tony was saying about 50 hours for his playthrough. Mine was 150, I reckon. I was about 142 hours on the save plus dead time. Yeah.
That is a big jump.
And I'm not claiming to be very efficient. I was very inefficient with a lot of the stuff, because I actually tried to do this fairly legit to start with, and then it was just taking too long. It's even when you try to minimize the time, that's sort of where you sort of falls at around that 140 to see most, if not all, of the content. So,
wow, that's a lot of time. That is a lot of time. But I did like the sphere grid. At the end of the day, I liked the sphere grid. And the sphere grid kind of goes hand in hand to a degree with the combat system, because ultimately the way that you build your characters will impact your overall ability in combat. And there are a few aspects of combat that I thought were really cool touches, some of which were similar to other Final Fantasy and other JRPG kinds of games. Others were a bit more unique. So just high level, a couple of things that I found really interesting were the fact that the game operates all of the spells, or at least most of the spells in the game, operate in a fairly traditional kind of elemental counter kind of system. So as an example, if you were using fire, the counter to fire is ice and vice versa. Or if you're using water, the counter to water is electricity and vice versa. So I thought that was a relatively simple system, but it was also something that, at least as I was playing through the game, it was interesting to be able to see that, okay, you have a lightning monster that has sparks coming off of them, and you can pretty much guarantee that if they had sparks coming off of them, you'd want to attack them with a water spell in order to maximize your overall damage. There are certain items that you can get that have what they call a sensor ability, where you can actually see what the weaknesses and the strengths are of individual monsters. And I did end up using that for some of the ones that didn't really have an obvious visual tell. But generally speaking, I did enjoy the fact that there was this elemental counter system built into the game. I also liked the fact that different characters themselves were almost used as counters against different kinds of creatures. So as an example, Waka, one of the characters we talked through, his main attack is throwing a blitzball, different kinds of blitzballs, but throwing a blitzball at different monsters. And at least in my relatively limited usage of Waka, the main time I would use Waka is if there was a flying enemy. Because as a flying enemy, if you're trying to use one of your melee characters like Titus or Aaron, I wasn't really able to hit them all that well. I would swing, I would miss, it would be frustrating, but Waka is designed to hit these flying kinds of creatures. So you bring Waka in, you throw your blitzball at them, and the creatures would be hit and oftentimes die, whereas Titus and Aaron would just completely swing and miss. So I really enjoyed the counter system built into the game. I thought it was an interesting twist on the traditional kind of Final Fantasy formula. So I don't know if you have any particular thoughts on the counter system. I know it's relatively simplistic, but it is something that stuck out and was one of those things that, from a strategic perspective, I thought Final Fantasy X did really well. Just as far as starting to engage you in the broader aspects of combat.
Yeah, it's quite intuitive, as you say. Like, you can tell a fire enemy is a fire enemy, and typically you find out pretty quickly if you use fire on fire enemy, you start healing them. So you learn that very quickly that that's not helpful. So you sort of you pick it up. It's not complicated. It's a rock paper scissors sort of dynamic, and it works well. As you say, like the Waka being useful for flying enemies is great. Orin actually has a piercing ability, so enemies with high armor, that sort of gets bypassed. And there's a few instances of that, and it's really interesting. Each character has their own sort of strengths and weaknesses, and typically an enemy that they are more suited to being taken out to use against. So yeah, I think it's fantastic. It's a really great system, and it continues to be engaging quite long into the lifespan of the game.
Now, kind of piggybacking off of the counter system is the weapon and armor system. And this is something where I will admit my own personal opinion has it kind of wavered as I went throughout the game. Because when I play an RPG, typically what I expect is as I get further and further into the game, I expect to get weapons that are demonstrably more powerful, or armor that is demonstrably more defensive than armor that I might have had. And you don't really have that in Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X has a ton of different weapons. They have a ton of different armors. There's even an upgrade system where you can add different stats or different abilities to both weapons and armor. But it's not like you're going to get a new weapon and it's going to have a +5 on strength, as an example. There might be an ability on there that would add a certain percentage point to, or a certain percentage to your strength stat. But it's not like you're going to look at a weapon and see a bunch of stats and you're going to see a bunch of green numbers where things are improving and a bunch of red numbers where there might be less than what you have on your current equipment. So it took me a little bit of time to get used to this overall system for weapon and armor kind of loadouts, but you know what? I'm still on the fence. I got to be honest with you, ISO. I'm still on the fence with this one because on one hand, I get the upgrade system and how it works within the game, but on the other, it still felt very different to me than what a typical RPG equipment system would be, and I'm not sure that I loved it at the end of the day. I didn't mind it, but I don't know that I loved it.
It's forgettable, isn't it? You can actually go through most of the game without really delving into it at all. You know, like you grab an item and you'll pretty much. I know in my first playthrough, I barely even changed the loadouts at all because they're so instant. They're almost not worth mentioning because until later game where you get like status effects like poison, sleep, and stuff that petrify, they're the three that you really need to worry about because otherwise you just need to build resistance to that because you've got enemies that can almost knock you out in a single turn if you haven't got resistance or immunity to those three effects. But as you say, like because nothing's directly attached or dynamically changed in the stats, because it's all built into the sphere grid, it almost is, you don't need to worry about it. And I actually found even until quite late in some of my playthroughs, I still had the basic shield on Titus. And I was like, oh, shoot, I should have changed that ages ago, you know? And you just don't think about it because there's already so many other mechanics that sort of cover it. And it also almost feels like it's worthless in a lot of senses. And until you sort of, you hit a roadblock where you're getting caught with a boss or a certain encounter type where you can go into your inventory and go, okay, I've got something that will stop petrify. Great, I'll equip it to anybody that's going to be in that battle, and then you'll forget about it until you get caught again. And it's great that it's there, but it feels like it could have been worked into the sphere grid to sort of minimize the amount of pushback against the player. You know, it just feels like another job that the player has to do.
And you know, that's actually a really good way to explain it, is to call it forgettable. Because you're right. It's one of those things where in most RPGs, every time I'd get a new item, I would always want to see what the stats were. I would always want to see what the improvement was. Whereas at a certain point playing Final Fantasy X, I didn't even care what I was picking up. At a certain point, my inventory was so overloaded that I had to sell stuff because I was just not even thinking about it. I wasn't thinking about equipping the latest stuff. And I know that when you get certain items, they have different slots that you could potentially upgrade, but it did feel kind of forgettable at the end of the day. But the one aspect of the game and the combat system that I thought was actually incredibly memorable and something that I wish was in every single RPG ever. And certainly now that I've any RPGs I play from this point on, if it's not there, I'm going to miss it incredibly, is the way that party mechanics work and the fact that in the middle of a battle, you can switch in and out any of your available party members at any point, pretty much, and effectively have battles where you can have all of your characters at different points participate in that battle, depending on what's happening in the battle, depending on what effects might be out there, depending on if you need a healer to come in and cure some status ailments and then go back to doing damage. The fact that you could switch your characters in effectively at a whim, other than a couple of series in the games or a couple of sequences in the game where you had very specific loadouts that you had to maintain. For the most part, you had incredible freedom about how you mixed and matched all of the different characters as you played the game. And from my perspective, that made the Final Fantasy X combat system, or at least that aspect of the combat system, might be one of my favorite implementations in a Final Fantasy game, if not general JRPG ever. I loved the ability to switch characters in and out.
It's really, and there's not a lot of penalty for it, is there? You can swap a character out, bring a character in that is more suitable for the situation you're in, and you're not penalized. Like a lot of JRPGs will say, "Oh, well, they've lost their turn." No, you get your turn. You get your turn when you swap out, and that can actually play into your strategy a lot. You have somebody swap out who's going to get attacked. If there's you're predicting a AOE attack that's going to affect everybody, get your main character out, swap somebody else that's going to survive the attack, swap them back out again, and then you've got your attack. There's a lot of different things that sort of come into play later in the game, and it's a great system. And the system sort of works on a turn timer, which is broadcast very clearly to the player on the top right-hand corner. So I think it's about 16 to 18 turns are telegraphed. So there's no surprise who's going next. You know which enemy is going to be attacking next. And there is like a hidden ticker system. So the abilities that you use will affect that counter, like the turn timer, but it won't affect it dramatically. So if you use an item that's a lesser cost than doing an attack. So if you use a healing potion, you're less likely to go lower down the list for your turns. So it's interesting, and it's a little bit, because that is hidden, it's a little bit more of a sort of, you get a feel for it more than, so there are some nuances that the player sort of has to come to grips with, but it is very fair, and at no point really, apart from a couple of in-game bosses and some status effects, you really don't feel like you've been gypped. You know, you feel like you've made the mistake in a battle when you've lost. So I do appreciate that.
And one of my favorite things to do with the whole party switch thing was, especially, and this is something I did a lot with some of the harder bosses, certainly later in the game, is I would basically bank on my characters and get almost all of their overdrives up, and then I would basically switch them in and out to try to use all of the overdrives on the harder characters. And I would do the same kind of thing with the Aeons, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But tell us a little bit about the overdrive system, because I thought that was a really interesting way of adding additional unique abilities to each of the individual characters. Some were more useful than others from my perspective, but I did like the fact that it added some sort of unique skill that each character, assuming that they would fill, and it's kind of just for everybody's awareness, the overdrive is almost like the limit break system in, I believe it was Final Fantasy VII that had limit break, if I'm not mistaken. But it's basically a meter that eventually it gets to the top, and then you're able to unleash some sort of devastating or special maneuver. I used it a lot in my playthrough. Was that something you used too, ISO?
Yeah, it's interesting because, like in Final Fantasy VII, you can bank these. So I think that you're correct in it does bring a lot to each character, and the way that they've built, like the overdrives don't necessarily, they're not just the one overdrive all the time. You can actually increase and upgrade these overdrive, or almost call them limit breaks, these overdrives for each character. Some don't. Some, like Riku's mix, is the same throughout, but Waka gets like a slot machine, so he can do status reels, attack reels, elemental reels. So that, like, it's almost like a lottery, not a lottery, like a slot machine, and you spin it like a little mini game. You hit X, and it adds a lot. And he actually becomes quite overpowered if you use his overdrive correctly. Oren will build up his overdrives through finding spheres in the world, not to be confused with the spheres in the sphere grid. These are like little home movies that you find throughout the story, like little memory capsules. And as he finds a certain amount of those, his will upgrade, and Titus's will upgrade based on the amount of times you use it. So you're actually better off using Titus's overdrive as much as possible, rather than banking them, because it does take quite a while to get to his final overdrive. You've got to use it about 300 times collectively. So and they're just like super powerful attacks, which prompt a mini game. Each are different depending on. Titus's is like a sliding bar, and as I said before, Waka's is just a reel. Lulu's is like, you've got to do the old Mario Party, kill your hand doing the spinny around the rotations on the analog stick and destroy your controller. But yeah, they're interesting. Yeah, and I think they're dynamic and they're worthwhile. They do a lot of damage. So.
You know, the other kinds of, or the other place that overdrive like skills come into play is with the summoned creatures in the game, the Aeons, which is this game's version of, for the Final Fantasy VI players, the Espers, where these are the ultra powerful creatures that you can summon in the midst of battle, and they have their own special abilities and even their own overdrive kinds of powers. I would do the same kind of thing with Aeons as I would do with the general overdrive system for the characters, which is Yuna was the only character in the game, at least to the best of my knowledge, unless something else opens up in the end game. But Yuna was the only, I think Yuna's the only character that can actually summon the Aeons into the battlefield. And over the course of time, you get a fair number of Aeons. Some of them are optional, some of them are required by the story, but they would all have their own special abilities, and their overdrive abilities almost universally were incredibly powerful, especially some of the later game Aeons. So I would do the same kind of thing. I would get them all banked up to have their overdrive, and then I would just summon them one after another if I was fighting a really difficult boss, and hopefully take them down sooner rather than later.
And they work as a bit differently to the summons in Final Fantasy VII. They become their own character, essentially. So they've got their own health bar, they've got their own menu, so you can actually teach the Aeons abilities. So you can use your black magic through your Aeons as well. And when they fall in battle, they don't necessarily hurt party, so you can use them as that buffer. So if you're expecting a giant attack from a mega boss, then you can put them out as a scapegoat, essentially. So there's a lot of utility to these Aeons, and they fit really well into the story. And I think that's something that should be commended with Final Fantasy X. They really work this stuff into the story really well.
I would agree with you. I think that the story in Final Fantasy X, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but the story in Final Fantasy X is probably one of my favorite aspects of the entire game. I think they did a phenomenal job with the overall story. And to your point, I think they did a great job integrating all of these different mechanics, all of these different features, the Aeons, the characters, and just the way everything comes together. It feels like it was an integrated whole. It wasn't like there was something off to the side that they just decided to throw in for the heck of it. It feels like it was all there for a reason, and it all served some purpose within the overall narrative of the game. So I agree with you. I appreciated the way that Square went off and designed this one. It definitely feels more integrated than I think their prior efforts, at least in the Final Fantasy series, were.
Yeah, definitely. And it goes to show, like, there's a lot of documentaries and stuff like everything's sort of in this story and in the gameplay, that it all ties back into each other. Everything's feeding off of each other. It's not there for no reason. Design choices are made for a reason, and they stick true to that more often than not, which I think really does help the product in the end, which is so frustrating when the voice acting sort of then takes you out of it so quickly, and there are some holes in the story as well, but it really does hold up for the most part. So
Even beyond that, now that I'm thinking about it, the story even came out in some of the bigger battles where within individual battles you could even talk in certain situations to the boss with certain characters, and doing that would actually give you additional attributes for certain characters as you did that, which I thought was a really nice touch to throw even beyond the spectacle of the boss fights and the lead up to the boss fights, even internal to the boss fights themselves. There was a little bit of story every now and then, which I thought was a really awesome addition. And once again, kind of proves and shows just how much of a narrative focus this game had.
and it's risky too. Like, do you talk to the guy that's about to kill you, or do you just get on with it? Like, is that buff to magic really worth it? But you also want the story, like the context of that character probably would confront the big bad guy that's just shaking up the whole world. Like there's a lot of that sort of plays into it quite nicely, and they're not all the time. They're sort of scarce, and it's also context sensitive actions that you can make where you can sort of attack an environmental thing, and it can dynamically change the battle in your favor, and they're few and far between, but they're an interesting sort of a spice to the mix.
Yeah, it is one of those things that wasn't used a lot, which I think made it so that when it was used, it felt even a little bit more impactful than what it otherwise would have felt. And the fact of the matter is, as you're exploring throughout the entire game, there's a lot of game here. I mean, if you just look at the straight main story, like I said, it took me around 50 hours to get through the main story. And the majority of that, and this is something that I am a little bit on the fence about. The majority of that story and the majority of the exploration and the design of the game world and pretty much everything about the game up to a very late game point is all linear. It's basically, and this kind of ties into the conversation we were just having about the story, which is the story is the focus here. The designers behind Final Fantasy X wanted to deliver a very specific narrative. They didn't want you to necessarily go off on a bunch of different tangents. Like, I think about a game like Baldur's Gate 2 as an example, where you have a main storyline thread and you can choose to progress just down that main storyline thread. Or you could choose in Chapter 2 to literally complete around 50 hours worth of side content before you even get on with the main quest, which some people would argue is not really realistic considering the severity of the main issue in the game. But it's something that it allows. Final Fantasy X does not allow that at all. There's very little free exploration until really late in the game. And part of me says, I like it. Part of me likes that concept because it did keep the focus on the story. But the other part of me felt a little handcuffed, especially in comparison to other JRPGs that I've played, where, yeah, you might not necessarily have a true open world to explore, but you did have some more choice around where you navigated to. And the fact is that in Final Fantasy X, let's say you missed something early in the game, you're not going to go back to get that thing unless you get very late game to make it easier to get back there. And even if you do that, that location might have changed because up until very late game, you have to walk literally everywhere. And I will say that for me, that was, I am definitely not convinced that was the perfect way to design it, but I understand why they did. And I don't know what you feel about that one, ISO, but I was a little taken aback with just how linear the game was for how long.
I think it works for the story that they're telling. I think if the story had been different, it probably wouldn't have worked as well. I think because you've got again, it's not the urgency that's causing it, but I think the pacing really is something this game should be commended about. Like, if you're following the main story beats all the way through, which you pretty much have to, as you're sort of saying, you get a really nice flow. You've got different mechanics being introduced at the right sort of rate. for the most part, the difficulty sort of ramps up to the right sort of things, and then at a certain point, the game does open up, which can frustrate people, being sort of corridory all the way to a certain point. But I think for this particular story, it works quite well. But it is frustrating not being able to go back to the places you visited to late game, and then they do really, really slap your hand when you do go back sometimes. So there is a lot that you can miss. So it does sort of hurt you if you miss something, and they're very easy to miss. There's just some stuff that you sort of need at locations where you don't necessarily know what you're looking for, and then you can miss it. And then when you do go back there, yeah, slap your hand. So
Well, I'll give you a prime example. For the majority of the game, I had to have missed so many of the Albed
the
translation
Albred primers.
dictionaries or whatever they were. So for anybody who might be unaware, one of the aspects or one of the features of the game, there is a different language that appears on signs. Some characters even speak this different language, and scattered around the game world, there are these translation books, and you've got to find a bunch of different volumes of the language primer in order to be able to translate that language and understand what people are saying or what signs are saying or whatever. And I will say that by the time I realized that I had missed a bunch, I was already probably halfway through the game. And it's not like I'm not an explorer. I like exploring around game worlds, but I just must have missed them dramatically. And I don't even know where the heck they were. But then you look and you kind of say, okay, well, how can you get them back? And that's where I realized, well, wait, that means I'm going to have to walk all the way back there, all the way back to wherever I missed it. And it just was not an appealing thought in my head to waltz all the way back through all of that content.
Yeah, and it's sort of unnecessary in some regards, like because that's interesting to have. It's like a letter replacement in the alphabet. So if you miss A, then you can sort of piece the language together without it. But it's yeah, it is definitely frustrating when you miss one of those, and then especially when you can't go back. But there are a few ones that you can't go back and get. So. But you can load that back into your save file. So if you want to go back and grab it on a different save file, you can compile it from a different save file. So there are ways around it, but definitely a bit of a miss there, and in the sense that you can miss some of that content.
At this point, it probably makes sense to talk a little bit about the end game and optional content, because this is an area that I have literally no experience with. Like I've been saying a few times, I basically played the main quest. I did not explore beyond that. So as far as what I experienced the standard story. I experienced the zones and the different areas that you progress through, all of the different temples and trials that you have to go through, and which are kind of like this game's dungeons that have some puzzle elements in it. I experienced all the mainline stuff, but I know that I missed a lot because I didn't go off and do a ton of grinding. I didn't do a lot of the end game content, which is obviously even harder than what the actual true boss of the game is. Like, this end game stuff is ridiculous. ISO, I know you did go through and complete pretty much everything in the game. So I'm very curious what your thoughts are around the end game content, the amount of grinding that you have to go through in order to actually complete the end game content, and just all of the stuff around it. Like, I look out on these message boards and I see discussions about celestial weapons. And my first thought is, what the heck's a celestial weapon? Because I didn't get one. I don't know what it is. I'm assuming it's an end game item, but I didn't go down that path. I just didn't spend the time to do it.
Well, that was sort of when I was alluding to the weapons and armor earlier, that they become even more useless when you sort of find out that there are a weapon for each character that is, it's not a debate. It is the best weapon. There's no other weapon that even comes close. They've got the best ability. They've got some special stats built into the actual weapon, which just make them so much more powerful. But to get those items, you really have to do some work. So there are a lot of mini games tied to it. So we haven't mentioned the monster arena. So this game does have a monster catching mechanic. So you can go back and backtrack to different areas, and using a special weapon, you can collect these monsters, and then you can fight them in the arena. So there's a lot of the celestial weapons are tied to that monster arena. There's also some really frustrating mini games, which I don't even want to hear the Chocobo race theme ever again in my entire life. I spent about 4 hours with Titus sitting on the back of this dumb Chocobo running around popping balloons as seagulls. They quite literally just fly. It's the dumbest thing, and it's so frustrating because it's randomized too. And you've got to get -1 a time. So for every balloon you get a time. You get time taken off your run, and it's just so frustrating. So anybody that's done it and got the celestial weapon for Titus is a hero in my book, because it takes forever. And then there's another one for Lulu, which is you've got to jump in the thunder plains 200 times and dodge the lightning.
Well, that sounds awful. I tried to dodge the lightning just playing the normal game, and I think I did it once.
You can't do it. It's so hard. So there are exploits to make your job easier, but 200, and it doesn't tell you, so you got to count as you're doing it. And if you leave the screen or save the game, it resets the counter. So you get really frustrated.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So where I've got a bit of issue is some of the end-game content, because in some regards it does reward the player's time, which some of the extra Aeons that you get, like Anima, the Magnus Sisters, and Yojimbo, they're not out of the realms of collecting in a normal playthrough. That they take a little bit of extra effort, but they're not ludicrous. Once you start getting to defeating the Dark Aeons, and that's the slap in the wrist I was mentioning before, you go back to your hometown and Yuna's hometown, Besaid, and you get attacked by this Dark Aeon. It's hard. There's a real spike, even when there is a bit of a spike in the end game. This is ridiculous, and you really do need to maximize your stats using the sphere grid. So you get to a certain point, and it's almost insurmountable. I nearly gave up.
Well, you were telling me some of those fights could last up to 40 minutes long.
Yeah,
and if you make a mistake, it's like it's done.
Yeah, the final boss named Penance. So once you defeat all the Dark Aeons, there's an optional boss called Penance, and that is, you need to have very high stats in order to even stand a chance. And it's not difficult in the sense that it is a pattern, and once you learn the pattern, it's quite easy. But again, it's a lot of mental counting. You're doing counting, and there are different elements that you're sort of trying to juggle all in the same battle, and then you get to 20 minutes and your daughter jumps on you and you miscount one of your things, and then you're going to do it for another 40 minutes. Not bitter about that at all.
Wow.
My sweetheart didn't mean to do that. She didn't know, but it's yeah, definitely it is a time commitment, and grinding this stuff manually is near on impossible. There are tricks, the Don Tomberry trick. I'm sure anybody that's played this game to the point where you beat the Dark Aeons will know all about it. There are exploits, and again, there are YouTube channels that detail this stuff in far greater detail than I will, but it's a lot to it, and for what you get for it, I'm not sure if it's worth it, but I got a lot out of it. I enjoyed it for the most part, but yeah, there's a lot of busy work.
You know, the one thing that strikes me just as we keep talking through the game is that there is a lot to Final Fantasy X. I mean, this is a massive game. It's as massive as you want it to be.
And the stuff that we're missing too, like I was like, oh, I remember that. Like you can actually swap your overdrives to different methods of building the overdrives, which stuff you don't even really need to worry about. Like there's just so much different nuance to it. Like, and you get as much as you put into it, I guess. As you're saying, it's the more you delve, the more you find.
And if you can believe it, there's even more that we need to talk about related to Final Fantasy X. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box. Because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with a ton of gameplay videos. Back then, when we made a buying decision, oftentimes that was based on word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we might have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. For this episode's edition of Back of the Box, I'm actually going to hand it over to ISO because he has the Final Fantasy X box in front of him. So ISO, take it away.
I've got the platinum. That's how well it's
the platinum.
The platinum. So that was when they dropped it down in price, and you got a discount, I think. So it's got like the silver box around the cover art. So the back of the box says, "The magical world of Spira is under threat from sin. An evil entity unleashes havoc and terror and destruction. Join Titus, a heroic blitzball star, and Yuna, a courageous girl skilled in the ancient art of summoning, as they embark on the epic quest to defeat Spira's deadliest enemy. Only the final summoning can defeat sin and bring peace back to Spira. Enhanced facial motion system." There's a picture of Titus looking a bit dumb. "Stunning 3D environments and new conditional turn-based battle system."
And that is the back of the box?
That's the back of the box. So there's 3 screenshots and a picture of Yuna doing ascending, which is quite a beautiful image. The screenshots, they're pretty good, not too bad. I'm not sure if I would have picked those ones as they don't really highlight anything. There's one of a battle system, and then there's a couple of just highlighting the character models. But yeah, not a lot on the back, so I'm not sure about that. Whether it would have sold me. I actually think the front's pretty iconic. I've always really loved the Final Fantasy series for their illustrations on the front, how each one has its own beautiful artist rendition. So yeah, I'm a bit of a sucker for that. But yeah, the back doesn't say a lot.
Yeah, I don't know. Given your description, I don't know that would have sold me on it. I mean, I did buy it back when it came out, but the description doesn't fully do it for me. I will say that the front of the box in this case, and I'm not sure if it's the same front of the box as what you have in your version, but I remember vividly what the box for Final Fantasy X, or the disc case, I should say, for Final Fantasy X looked like, and it was pretty impressive. But the back of the box, I don't know. I don't know that would have sold me on it either.
Was yours the white background with the illustration, or was it Titus in the water?
It was Titus. Yeah, mine was the Titus one.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, I've obviously bought this too, because most of the games that we purchased were secondhand, but this one looks like a new one. So I must have gone out and bought this with real money. So it definitely worked, the marketing, but I think a lot of it was I'd already played it from renting it and stuff. So when it's already sold 8 million copies, I think it's probably got a pretty good word of mouth already. So
that's probably a fair assumption. We're going to move on to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. And I think we're going to go we'll ping pong this one. So I'll give my opinion on graphics, then ISO, and then ISO, you give your opinion on sound and music. I'll give mine, and we'll kind of ping pong it back and forth.
Yep.
So from my perspective, the graphics in Final Fantasy X look amazing. There are highly detailed environments and character models. The boss fights, in particular, are spectacles. And summoning Aeons and using their special moves never gets old. The game simply looks great. I really don't have any complaints. Even the animations are mostly good, though I will say the lip syncing, and we talked a little bit about the lip syncing and the issues around that earlier. The lip syncing does show its age, and it doesn't really map to the actual dialogue, the recorded dialogue that plays out. But overall, that's pretty much the only issue I had with the graphics. I thought the game looked great. I thought the pre-rendered visuals and the different cinematics that play look amazing. And even the in-game environments and the in-game characters, I have no complaints. It's a great looking game from my standpoint.
I think it does a really good job considering the age that it still looks pretty good. Like I've seen worse looking games even today. I think the visual design is to be commended. The actual menus and the way the style of the different characters is top notch. The CGI cutscenes, while they don't always match the character models in the game, I don't know if you had that sort of disconnect as I did, Tony. They're beautiful. Like the bit where Yuna is doing the sending in Kilika, that was like a tech demo for Sony for so long. Like that iconic image of her dancing in the water is just that probably sold consoles, let alone copies of this game. It's really beautiful. And there is a disconnect there when you go out of those CGI cutscenes. You've got like the sort of faces that look a bit flat. That's not that depth. The remaster does alleviate that a little bit, but even when I was playing this when I was 15, I could sort of notice the difference in those, like the CGI to the in-game rendered stuff. So I've got no complaints. So other than that, it's a beautiful game.
Yeah, I agree. It looked really good. Now, how about the sound and music? What do you think about? Let's start talking about the music, because there's two aspects of the sound I want to talk through. Definitely the music, but then also the voice acting. So we'll start with the music. That one's probably an easy one. What do you think about the music?
The best. Honestly, I don't think there is anything other than it. I know a lot of Final Fantasies have got a pretty high bar, but I've been listening to this almost on repeat for about 6 months since we started this project of playing through the game, and it's incredible. It's varied. It's beautiful. It really does just run the gamut of, like, you've got really soft, understated stuff that really works well with the story, and then you got stuff that's really big and bold. Like you've got the fight or battle themes and like challenge, like the Unalesca song. It just gets your blood pumping. Like I just put it on in the car to get going, and I recommend anybody that has played the game or is interested in music at all, like just go for a long walk in a national park or something like that, and put this soundtrack on. You'll get a lot out of it. I really got no complaints. Fantastic.
Yeah, I will say that it has been a while since I've loaded a video game soundtrack actually onto my phone to have it with me wherever I go. And I did that with Final Fantasy X. The music is incredible. I loved every single track. The Xanarkand theme is, that's very widely known, but I've got to say, I loved that theme. I loved so many songs in the game, but I've got to say that the battle theme, this is just the general battle theme for Final Fantasy X, I think might be my favorite battle theme out of any Final Fantasy game. And it's just, everything about the music here is phenomenal. I'm not sure. I'm a little bit kind of wishy-washy as far as whether this soundtrack is my favorite Final Fantasy soundtrack or if that still belongs to 6. So historically, I've always thought 6 has had the best soundtrack, followed by 7. Now with 10, oh man, that's a tough one, because it's a really good soundtrack. I'm not gonna lie. I can't not give it credit for being just phenomenal.
I was listening to some of these songs for like 4 hours, like apart from the Chocobo theme, which I don't want to hear ever again. Some of them, like just in, like when you're doing this figure, they can take a little bit of time. Like you're listening to these songs for a long time. They don't outstay their welcome. They're good. Like you keep listening to them, you keep getting more out of them, and then you go to a different area and you get another track that's really does hold its own to pretty much anything. So it's good that you can listen to some of these songs for quite long periods of time without getting sick of them.
Yeah, that's a great point. I could probably listen to those songs almost indefinitely. The one aspect of the game I can't listen to indefinitely is the voice acting. And I know we've talked about it a little bit already, but oh my,
Tony,
I have got to say,
can we do the ha 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 together, please?
Oh my God. And I know that scene was intended to be awkward.
Yeah, it's but 2 minutes.
But wow. Just in general, the voice acting here, voice acting The voice acting in Final Fantasy X tried its hardest to take you out of every single moment that you wanted to feel something throughout the game. Now, luckily, the story was good enough and the game was good enough beyond it that the voice acting failed to do that. But I have got to question I have to question what they were really thinking here. I've got to imagine, and I don't have any proof of this, but I've got to imagine that the Japanese voice acting, the original Japanese voiceovers, I'm assuming have to be better than the English voice acting that we got with the game. I'm assuming that it's something where something was lost in the translation because I don't know. I mean, I very rarely use the word hate, but I kind of hated most of the voice acting in the game.
It's just the jarring nature of it. For the most part, I didn't have as many issues, I think, as you did. I started to fall in love with some of the characters, the ones that I didn't like, but it would be one line in a sea of about 20 that would just throw me way out, and you do get a hard time getting back to where you were. And I'm not sort of trying to be over dramatic. It is quite literally that bad. Some of the lines, it just boggles your mind, and you go, "What am I listening to? It doesn't make sense." Like, but for all the stuff it does wrong, I think it probably would have suffered if it was a text only. I feel like you build a connection to certainly some of the major players. I think even most of the minor characters, Seymour was quite good. The Crusaders, most of those voice actors are really good. It's just, yeah, Yuna and Titus for the most part, and a lot's riding on them too. So it is disappointing when some of those lines fall flat. So I think I'm less sour on it than you. I think the second playthrough did help. I think when I played it the first time, I had a lot more issues, but second time, I expected it.
I will, yeah. I mean, I will say that out of all of them, Titus and Yuna were probably the two that I had the biggest issues with. Titus by far was the one I had the most issues with. I just felt like he was portrayed as so whiny throughout the entire game, through most of the game. And then there were a couple points where he kind of turned a corner, but then there'd be another line 15 minutes later where he's just back to that normal whiny self. And it was just, I don't know. I mean, I agree with you that I think that it did help to form a connection with the characters by having the voice acting there. I kind of wish that it was better. I wish that the voice acting was better all around. Although I will agree that a lot of the side characters were actually better voice acted than some of the main characters. Like Seymour, I thought was great. I really enjoyed the voice actor who did that performance. I did enjoy, like I mentioned before, Aaron. I thought he was consistently good. I thought that Lulu definitely grew on me over the course of the playthrough. Titus did not. At least his voice acting did not. I liked the character by the end, but I did not like the voice acting at all. And Yuna was just inconsistent. Everybody else was kind of like, okay, there. But Yuna and Titus were by far the ones that rubbed me the wrong way.
Definitely. And as you say, a little bit can be forgiven for the restraints that they had for the game. But yeah, a lot of it can't.
So moving on to story, you've spent more time with the game than I have by far. So tell us a little bit about the story.
Oh man, okay. How do you condense a 70-hour plot into a 2-minute blurb? We'll go really quick. No, Titus is a superstar blitzball player. In Zanakin Abes. So the game starts. He's about to play in his father's Memorial Cup, and he's killing it. He's doing a great job, and suddenly there's a massive attack. He is greeted by a guardian figure, somebody he knows, which is Orin, and they sort of proceed to ride through the chaos until they're both sucked into a portal to another world. So this is the classic fish out of water story. Titus is transported to this world where he doesn't know a lot. So you as a player is sort of in the same boat as him, trying to unravel why he's been sent here and what this world is. It's quite different to his own. So he is sort of thrown into this world where he doesn't know what's going on. He meets characters one by one. He meets Riku to start with, and then again he's teleported out of this world again. So after being transported, it becomes clear that the monster that has transported Titus and Auron to this world named Spira is an evil entity that
Kind of like this evil being that is cyclical in nature.
Yeah.
Right? Like he kind of shows up on a recurring basis. He gets put away for a while and then comes back and just keeps coming back. And this pilgrimage that Yuna's on is just the latest in a long line of summoner pilgrimages to take care of this evil entity.
Yeah. So after Titus has been transported to this new world, he sort of gets wrapped up in the politics of the world that he's sort of encountered, most of which sort of centers around Yuna. She is a summoner who has been tasked with defeating the monster that sent you to this world in the first place. So she goes on a pilgrimage collecting aeons, and this whole world is sort of destroyed by this monster that keeps coming back. It's really a deep story that sort of questions like faith, and it's really like there's a lot of father issues and a lot of deeper stuff that sort of comes into the mix. But this main story is, trying to defeat this monster that's causing so much issues in the world. So, and obviously they fall in love, but in some capacity. But it is a love story for the most part, and without going into too many spoilers, I think it really is worth doing a deep dive on the story. So yeah, I'm not sure what you thought about it, Tony, but I was pretty impressed for the most part. And there's a lot of detail that I'm sort of not going into here. I take the fantasy genre, like how Final Fantasy VII sort of turned it up on its head with the like cyberpunky sort of essence. This sort of takes a real Polynesian, Australian beach culture and puts it in a fantasy setting, which I think is really unique.
Yeah, I loved the story. I thought the story was amazing. It was one of those things where, and we kind of talked through it before, but there was such a focus on the narrative that they had to make it a very strong kind of story. And I think they achieved that. The story was great. The voice acting was the biggest detriment from my perspective to the enjoyment of the story. But I will say that the story was so darn good that even with the quality of the voice acting, it never truly detracted from the story that the game was trying to tell. I enjoyed pretty much every aspect of it. I enjoyed the fish out of water aspect with Titus being in a land that he doesn't know what the heck's going on. I really enjoyed the camaraderie that built between the different characters as you play the game, and the way that different characters grew along their arcs, like we were talking about before. And I enjoyed a couple of the twists that happened late in the game, which we're not going to spoil here, but maybe when we do our Sounds of the Classics episode, maybe we'll combine that with a little bit of a story deep dive, and we could talk about some of those spoilers, because I have many thoughts about some of the twists that happen in the game. But I won't mention them here, but I will say I enjoyed them. I thought they were very interesting and kind of thought-provoking in a way. So I think they did a great job on the story. I think it was one of the shining moments, or one of the shining aspects of the game was certainly the narrative and story.
Yeah, there's a lot to go into too. Like the details that this team has sort of put into it is really boggling. Like you go to the temples and like the mandalas that are etched in the walls, they actually tell a story. Like you can really dive deep into some of the extended lore, and each town has got its own history, and it is you can spend hours talking about just the narrative alone. It's in depth, and you get a lot out of it. I've been thinking about it. It's symbolic. There's a lot of dual meaning. You can And I think intentionally they haven't explained a lot of different things because they wanted the people, the fans, to sort of draw a lot of that information out. So there's a lot of symbolism and parallels you can draw to other world events and stuff like that. There's a lot of source material that is drawing from real history. So it's riveting.
Yeah, I loved it. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we already talked through a lot of the gameplay. We talked through most of the gameplay actually already, so I don't think we should rehash all that here, but I do have just a few comments and a couple critiques about the game that I noticed as I was personally playing. So we talked a little bit about the Albed language primers that exist throughout the game world. Even though it was a very simple thing and a very simple touch, I did enjoy the fact that that was there and that you had almost like a little mini quest, a little mini collection quest to try to fill out the primer. It was 100% not needed for the full story. I did not complete my language primer by any stretch of the imagination. I think I maybe had 4 volumes by the end of the game, maybe 5. But I will say that it was cool to have. And one of the things that I found really interesting, and I don't know to what level of detail this goes, but you get to a certain point in the game where you're surrounded by characters that are speaking this language. And it almost felt, and ISO, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost felt like the voice, the actual recorded dialogue would shift ever so slightly depending on how much you've translated of the language. And maybe it was just like a standard voice line that played regardless of how much you had translated, but it felt like it almost shifted as I learned more about the language, which if that's the case, that was a really nice touch for something that was ultimately a very small aspect of the game.
100% sure, because it sort of translates each primer. There's only 26 volumes. It just changes a letter from the alphabet to an English letter, essentially. I'm not sure if there was quite possibly there was I didn't notice it myself, but it is an interesting sort of aspect to it because I feel like you get more out of it too. The more that you, like, as you play the game, you sort of you're picking up like somebody in a foreign land probably would, like you're picking up little bits of the culture, and you're also picking up what people are saying. You can work out, even if it isn't necessarily like an actual change in the language. It's you're personally picking up the context in which they're talking. So, and none of it is hugely critical to the story or to the gameplay. It's just an interesting sort of mechanic that brings a lot more depth. And there are little parts of the game that do that. There are some optional choices that the player can make that can ever so slightly change the story. Not dramatically enough to warrant a second playthrough, in my opinion, but it adds a little bit of flavor. And there's actually a mechanic in the game where your party members will have affection to Titus, depending on how you play the game. So I'm not sure if you even noticed that, Tony, or...
No, every single one of my party members hated Titus. So it was they just inhabited my feelings.
Yeah, you're projecting. I can tell you're projecting.
There was no affection.
But like the certain scenes, like you can get on a jet ski at a certain point in the game, and depending on which character it's highest on your preference, I'll ride with you, and you'll have a unique conversation depending on that. So it's very minor. Yeah, again, not worth a second playthrough, but it is interesting that mechanic's in there.
Interesting. I did not realize that. It probably won't make me play it again, to your point, but that is interesting that they at least included that kind of feature within the overall game. One of the other aspects of the game that I thought was a little confusing was the navigation, the map layout. So as you're navigating each of the screens in the game, you have a mini map of sorts in the top of your screen. And what I found was as I moved from one screen to the next or one scene to the next, I would oftentimes get confused what the right direction was or where I came from on that mini map or where I was going on the mini map, and I would get turned around. and I'm usually fairly okay with navigating 3D spaces. So this one was an odd one to me. It felt a little strange, and it felt like the navigation, at least as I was trying to walk around and move around the game world, it just felt a little off to me.
Yeah, I think because I'd played it previously, I was fairly familiar with the direction in which most things were. Like it'd been a number of years, but I was fairly confident in which there are definitely, as you mentioned, there are points that are far more complicated to navigate, and if you are to backtrack, you have to follow a linear path. It is surprisingly difficult considering it's a linear path. I don't know if you found that too, but yeah, there's definitely a little bit of a disconnect in that 3D world if you're not familiar with it. And also, once you do gain access to the airship, you don't necessarily get access to all the points that you want to go to. You still have to do a lot of backtracking, and I thought that was a bit frustrating, especially when you've got all that effort to go back and you've explored these lands already to then re-explore them for little to no payback. Like reward is frustrating, especially with random encounters. So.
And speaking of those random encounters and backtracking and all that kind of stuff, one of the other things I noticed, and I don't know if this is specific to the original version versus the remastered version, but I did find that there were some sections of the game where there were pretty long stretches between save points. And I remember at one point, I think it had to have been maybe 50-ish minutes in between saves for me. And I don't know if that was just because I was fighting a boss and it took me longer than expected on that boss, but it felt like early in the game, save points were placed almost on every single screen. And then a little bit later in the game, it felt like there were some pretty big gaps between save points, which is not a huge deal, but it is something where, because this was a game from the early 2000s, it could be a little unforgiving, especially because some of the fights that you get into later in the game, if you're not prepared with the right status counter, can legitimately just kill you, and then you're kind of stuck.
Yeah, I didn't notice it so much in my playthrough. I was playing on the Switch with the remaster. I thought they were very much in the early game. They were very forgiving with the save points. As you do mention, some of these fights do drag out, especially if you're to get to the end and get wiped out. Only to have that be a point that you have to restart, and then you can't skip those cutscenes. That is incredibly frustrating. There is a late game boss that I at least 2 or 3 times had to watch the same cutscene, and it does hurt the story too, because you having to watch that again and again and again. It sort of gets a bit frustrating. So I totally agree with you.
Yeah, that cutscene thing, the fact that you couldn't skip cutscenes, which really came into play later in the game, that was really frustrating because there is a significant difficulty spike later in the game, even before you get to the end game content, which I'm assuming is just a even more ridiculous difficulty spike. Even the main storyline, after a certain point, there is a dramatic shift in how hard the game is. And I will freely admit that there were late game bosses that I died to many times before I figured out the best way to approach them. And a lot of times what would end up happening is I'm at this boss fight and I don't have the right status counter equipment in order to make the fight a little bit more manageable. So I may not have had a petrify resistance for every one of the characters that I wanted to use, or I might have not had the ability to avoid zombie. I don't even know if there is a zombie.
This is zombie proof. Yeah.
Is there a zombie? Of course there is. I did not have it. I did not have any zombie proof. So there was one fight where I spent the entire time as a zombie, and actually the interesting mechanic with that fight, it actually, I think, enabled me to eventually beat that fight because of the mechanic that came along with it, or another mechanic that was part of that fight. But I mean, the status fights, this is something that I've had a complaint about with pretty much any RPG that relies or overly relies on status effects. I'm just not a huge fan. I enjoy the status effects as an additional challenge. at certain points. But there are some games, and late game Final Fantasy X is one of them, where I feel like the status effects just are constant, and you might spend your entire turn getting rid of the status effects just to have a group status effect ailment happen right after you finish that, and then you just wasted 3 turns getting rid of the status effect. So that was another, and that's kind of goes hand in hand with the difficulty spike, where I'm not a huge fan of the constant status effect kinds of fights. And I feel like late in the game, there was a lot of reliance on those kind of fights within Final Fantasy X.
They do relieve it a little bit in the sense that you can actually weapon and armor swap, but if you haven't got that already pre-made, then yeah, you're out of luck. And most, if not all, of the major bosses have got some sort of workaround. Again, it will depend on whether you've got the abilities to sort of do the little tricks that will make your fight a lot easier. But I seem to find personally that there was at least one sort of backdoor method for most of the major stumbling blocks. So whether that's a positive or a negative, I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, there was definitely some bosses that you could trivialize just by doing a certain play method, which I guess in some instances is just good on you for finding it, sort of thing. But yeah, certain bosses were made particularly easy by playing a certain way. So it's just discovering that way to play.
Interesting. So that's something I probably want to do some more research on, because if there's stuff out there that I just didn't realize could be done with certain bosses, or there's certain weaknesses, then that would alleviate a lot of my critique around it, because I found some fights, and this is especially later in the game, but I found some fights to just drag on and on and on, and it very well could be that I was either underpowered, or I didn't have the right skill set or armor or weapon to make the fight a little bit more of a manageable kind of affair. I can't even imagine tackling the Dark Aeons, given what I know about my own difficulty with some of the main quest kinds of bosses.
They're just brutal, mostly. Some of those are just
I'm sure.
And yeah, it really is an exercise in finding the optimal way to A, stat max, and B, play against the particular Aeon you're going against. So if you enjoy that sort of challenge, it's definitely rewarding, but it is definitely a big time commitment, and it's just delving into that sort of the raw numbers, whether you're interested in that or not, I guess.
So other than those critiques, I didn't really have a ton of other critiques, although I will say, and we mentioned Jecht, who is he's effectively Titus's father. There's a whole story arc and background and flashbacks about Jecht and Titus's relationship, and that actually forms a core part of the overall story as you play the game. And I've got to say that I did not like Jecht one bit.
You didn't like the abusive father figure? How could
I did not? No.
How could you not?
I really disliked him. I know he was meant to be unlikable, but he was just too much. I hated Jecht with every fiber of my being, and knowing how abusive he was towards Titus makes me understand why Titus was a whiny little bitch for most of my playthrough, because he had this guy for a father. I mean, it was bad. I don't know. I am not a Jecht fan at all.
I think on further analysis, I started to I found the character more interesting the more you delve into. I think it's worth either playing it again or sort of doing a deep dive. I recommend a podcast called State of the Arc. They go through the whole story of Final Fantasy X, and it's really riveting. But they sort of delve in like in detail, and they actually sort of, since I've been listening to that podcast, I think that he sort of changed my mind. Like it's interesting to see if you would change your mind based on it's hard to dance around spoilers. So Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if you change your mind if you're on a second playthrough, or if sort of listen to some. Maybe we could have a chat afterwards, see if I can change your mind. But the other thing, we'll get crucified at the cross if we don't talk about blitzball, because I don't think we've mentioned the blitzball mechanic at all.
Oh no, we haven't talked about blitzball. I hated blitzball.
Oh,
I hated the mechanic. I hated it.
No,
I played it once. I played it once for the main story, and I vowed never to touch it again because I absolutely hated it.
Oh no, it's fantastic. You could spend a whole lifetime playing that game.
Yeah, never winning. It was like this whole. It was completely unintuitive, and no matter what I did, there was not. Now maybe I just wasn't skilled enough. I recognize that I didn't spend a ton of time with it, but there was nothing about that first encounter that made me want to go back to Blitzball.
Did you get the jet shot?
No, I messed up on that one.
Okay.
I messed up on the deck shot, and I looked it up, and they said, "Hey, you can get it again later." And later never came. And maybe I overlooked it, but I messed it up the first time. I thought that it was going to be like many other games where, oh, okay, you screwed it up. Well, here's your next chance. But there wasn't. I didn't get a chance to get it. So I think I was probably operating without all of my tools.
It's quite difficult to win the story battle without it. I'm pretty sure. But
Okay.
yeah, the actual, after you play it for the main story, you can actually recruit members in the wider world. So if you go up and press a certain button, you'll certain characters will sort of say, "Hey, I love Blitzball, I'll join your team." And then there's sort of like a roster mechanic. It's quite an interesting sort of diversion, and you get that sort of relatively early in the story. So it's an interesting mechanic where you can sort of build your team. It is required for Waka's Overdrive, which is arguably the most overpowered thing in the entire game. But there's also a random element to it, which is quite frustrating. And I can see how you can get frustrated with the games, because they're quite long too. Like each quarter, it's a sped up 5 minutes, but you can spend, I think it's about 6 minutes in total playing a game of Blitzball, and you need to play a lot of Blitzball to end up getting some of the higher rewards out of it. So, but I love it. So,
the more I hear you talk about the different aspects of the game that I didn't touch upon in my playthrough, the more it kind of makes me want to play more of it.
Play 140 hours of it. Yeah, go.
Well, maybe not 150 hours, but like something more than what I did, because I wanted to experience the whole story. So I did that. But I also was a little time constrained, so I didn't have as much time to dive into the side content. But listening to you talk about some of the side stuff, I'm really interested, and I may actually fire up my save from right before the boss and try some additional stuff, because it does sound interesting. I don't know that I'm 100% sold on the grind and the 40-minute fights that if you make one mistake, you have to restart the whole thing. That sounds a little painful, but it is something that's interesting. And even the blitzball kind of thing. I know I said I hated it, but I really didn't try it all that often. And I don't know, it's something I could go back and give a little bit more time to. But listening to you talk about it is actually making me more interested in the game, which I didn't think was possible, because I actually really enjoyed the game for what it was. But the extra stuff beyond what I experienced, it sounds like there's so much. Final Fantasy X is a big game.
Yeah. There's a lot here, and I reckon you could alleviate that by making one of the challenges for this game blitzball related, and then you'll be forced to have to play it.
Oh, I love it. That's going to be one of our challenges. Definitely, it'll be blitzball.
Play 900 games of blitzball.
Well, no, not that, but something like that. Definitely something like that. But you know what? Even despite all the critiques, even despite the challenging voice acting, I'll use that term to be nice, at the end of the day, and by the time I got to the end of the game, you know what? Man, did I get emotional with that. The ending of the game, the very end, the ending sequence, the ending fight, the final sequence of the pre-rendered cutscene and everything, the way the ending played out, I thought the whole thing was a wonderful send-off for the game and its characters. And I thought that it was truly a testament to the overall quality of the game, the quality of the game's story, and pretty much everything else other than the few areas where I had some critique on it. It just all came together. And it was an amazing experience. And this was, honestly, this was a really good ending. Not to give any spoilers away, but this was emotional. I was surprised. I was surprised at how emotional the ending of the game was.
It's tackling really big concepts. Like, I think, like, to sort of pull off the landing that it does is actually quite commendable, because, like, really, it would be easy for it all to just fall apart at the end, which so many games do. You know, you've got these high concept things that you're tackling, and then, oh, we don't know how to end it. I was the same as you. I've been quite thinking about this since I beat it almost 2 months ago, and I'm still thinking about it. It's quite an emotional one, and as I sort of alluded to at the start, I stopped playing because I was so overwhelmed that I didn't want it to end. It was just so magical. I quite liked it. So I don't know if it's just me. Obviously, it's just you as well. So I mean, two people can't be wrong, right?
That's right. I think two people being right means it's 100% ironclad. No, it couldn't be anything else.
Totally agree.
So with all that said, what is our verdict on Final Fantasy X? ISO, I'm going to let you give your verdict and then I will give mine.
Oh, okay. So which one goes into the canon? Or does mine affect yours, sort of thing? So if I go really low, will it drag it down? Or if I go really high, will it drag it up? Or I'm quite happy to have separate lists, because I've got some opinions about some games that I can make my own.
All right. Yeah, well, you know, I mean, I know you love Little Big Adventure.
Yeah, I know
so...
that would go straight to the footnotes. No, I personally, I think this is a Pantheon entry for me. I've got a lot of nostalgia tied up, so totally understand it. And a lot of the end game stuff is unforgiving in terms of time commitments that it expects from the player. But again, you take the package as a whole, you know, like you without even adding the extra content, you've still got, it's not a 50-hour game, which for the time I think is quite impressive, really.
So I've got to say, Final Fantasy X is not a perfect game. There are certain things that it does that I kind of scratch my head. There's other things that it does that are irritations or make the gameplay a little bit more frustrating than what I would personally prefer. But the simple fact is that it does so many things so astronomically well that even its faults, some of which, like the voice acting, I really do kind of despise, even with those faults, it can't be dragged down. I can 100% see why many people consider Final Fantasy X to be one of the best JRPGs of all time and one of the best Final Fantasy games of all time. The stuff that it does well, it does really well. And it is so much that almost by default, it is better than the sum of its parts is better than the individual elements that might detract from the overall experience, which is why for me, and I agree with you, ISO, Final Fantasy X is absolutely deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. It is a true standout experience if you enjoy JRPGs or games with good stories or games with good combat mechanics, or pretty much if you enjoy games, you should play Final Fantasy X at some point over your gaming career. It is that darn good. And I really have, even though I have some critiques, I can't hold it really against it. Final Fantasy X is a remarkable experience, and I am so glad that you sponsored the episode on it and gave me a chance to right a wrong that has been plaguing me for almost 25 years. So I really appreciate you sponsoring that, ISO, and I further appreciate you joining me for this episode. I know this is a little bit different than what we normally do, but I've really enjoyed talking with you about Final Fantasy X, And we'll definitely have to do some of this more in the future. Maybe with our Sounds of the Classics episode, we can continue the discussion.
I'd be honored. It was magical. Thank you so much for having me, and I do appreciate the time that you put into to doing this. You know, it's I know you put in so much work, and to give you a 50-hour plus game to review is mean. But yeah, it's been great, and I've enjoyed this very much. And I would be honored to join you in any future projects, even though I probably tanked your ratings significantly, especially with that.
We'll have to see. I'll let you know the metrics.
See how many
We'll
people
what
listen
happens.
past the first 5 minutes, and then you might not invite me back.
Yeah, we'll see. No, but in all honesty, I think this was awesome. Thank you for joining me. And, Final Fantasy X, awesome game, 100% deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. It is now time to talk about our weekly challenges, which of course this week are focused all on Final Fantasy X for the Sony PlayStation 2. As always, be sure to post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord. So without further ado, let's get into those challenges. You can earn a coin if you fire up Final Fantasy X and make your way to a faraway world. Like we mentioned during the episode, the game starts off in one place and starts to get very quickly into another place. If you can get to that other place, which is effectively a part of Spira, so if you can get transported from your opening environment into a new world, that will earn you a coin. For 2 coins, all you've got to do is get up to the blitzball tournament. Pretty early in the game, you will face your very first blitzball tournament. If you can get up to that tournament and just participate in the game, you will get 2 coins. And then finally, if you can win that blitzball tournament, you will earn yourself 3 coins. This is going to be a little bit harder than what you might anticipate, at least based on my own experience, so definitely good luck with all of these challenges. You're going to need it. That was our episode on Final Fantasy X. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as we enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on the Crimson Diamond. So definitely write in if you'd like your feedback and comments featured on the show. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. Though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. And the only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on the Crimson Diamond. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.
月がにじ